Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy, very honored to bring the conversation I had with John Burt. John is professor of American literature at Brandeis University. His main research interests are 19th century American literature, 20th century American literature, Southern Gothic fiction, American romantic fiction, composition, and rhetoric. He is the author of the book, Lincoln's Tragic Pragmatism, Lincoln, Douglas, and Moral Conflict. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. As I mentioned in the conversation with John, I read this book when it came out over 10 years ago, so it's been out for a while. And it was such a singular book. It was very different. Of course, I mean, there's been thousands of books written on Abraham Lincoln. He's most Americans, including myself, favorite president. People around the world like Abraham Lincoln. So lots has been written on Abraham Lincoln. And it's basically feels like every, part of this president's life has been written on. There's a re-election, him as a congressman, him as a president, him as a war president, him and his speeches, like just all these different angles. And when I read John's book, it was not strictly historical, although there's obviously lots of history in there, but it was really doing kind of, seeing Lincoln as, many of his speeches and the debates he did with Douglas as like moral philosophy about one of the most important topics in the United States history, which is slavery, right? This has been such a dark chapter in our history, and they were right there at the kind of a front row seat to that as it was happening throughout history. Of course, Lincoln goes on to have the Emancipation Proclamation, and then subsequently the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But I was just kind of struck by how here was a book, and the book is 900 pages. I mean, and it is, rich with information, kind of from the introduction. So he just jumps into it. So I was very, very fortunate enough to get him on the podcast. He was very generous to come on. And not only was he generous to come on the podcast, but he was generous to give me 3.5 hours of his time and energy. He was really amped up to talk about this, and I mean, just over the moon happy about it. I mean, again, it's 900 pages, a lot of stuff in here, and so I really wanted to get a couple hours, and was thrilled when he said, yeah, we can do 3, and ends up that we clock in almost at 3.5 hours. So a lot of great stuff in this conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I truly did. So we start by talking about kind of generally, I think the first half hour we're kind of setting the table about what is Lincoln's tragic pragmatism for morals and public engagement. We obviously talk about slavery and emancipation, but the conversation, much like the book, it's less about names and dates and things like that. Of course, the Missouri Compromise is mentioned, popular sovereignty is mentioned, but it's really moral philosophy. And he cites throughout the book and in the conversation, Rawls, and Rawls is obviously huge for moral philosophy. We talk about things like implicit concepts, freedom, moral obsessions, and of course we talk about liberalism, which was really nice to talk about. I've had a few folks on the podcast that have talked about liberalism, what it is, what it isn't, what it is historically, what it should be for us now and moving forward. So it was nice to kind of do like a zoom in, zoom out of here's how it has been over time, and here's how these things impact us still today. And there's so many wonderful lessons from kind of the moral components of what Lincoln was discussing in the late 1850s and early 1860s. We talk about morals and violence. We talk about popular sovereignty. We talk about cultural shifts, the Whig Party, Rawls, some modern comparisons. LBJ is mentioned at a certain point in the conversation. America as an idea, and many other topics. Again, one of my favorite books I've read in the past decade or so. I enjoyed it even more rereading it, and it really was an honor and a privilege to talk with John, not only for half an hour, but to talk to him for 3.5 hours. Just really, really thankful for that. And much as I read the books, read the book twice, I had the conversation that was enriching, but had more thoughts and questions in the days and weeks afterwards. And so I really hope that people listen to the conversation and come away with a lot of thoughts and questions as well. And of course, feel free to reach out if you want to continue that conversation, or anything else. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergentdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So get over to the Substack, subscribe. That really means a lot. Really appreciate when folks do. And obviously tell your friends, tell people that might be interested in the podcast. There's, at this point, we're closing in on 450 episodes, which is wild. It's going to be 5 years in a couple of weeks. I've been doing this half a decade. It's crazy to think about. And so there are many conversations that I've had with everyone here that's been wonderful. Every guest has been wonderful. And there's something here for everybody to listen to pick up. So it's a wonderful back catalog. I've talked about liberalism. I've obviously talked a lot about history and American history. So if you like this conversation, there's plenty of other topics on the podcast that have touched similar themes. And now I bring you John Burt. I am here with John Burt. John, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really excited for our conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Certainly. I was telling you before we got started here, I picked up your book right when it came out in 2013, and I inhaled it, and I recently re-inhaled it, I guess, in preparing for this, and liked it the better the second read, 13 years later or 12 years later. So very, very, very happy. The book is called Lincoln's Tragic Pragmatism, Lincoln, Douglas, and Moral Conflict. And again, anyone that knows me, especially in my personal life, will know, I guess everyone is in some sense, but I'm a big Lincoln fan. It's probably one of my favorites. I know he's a favorite for a lot of people, blah, blah, blah. I get it. But I probably own 60 plus books on Lincoln himself, and I've read a lot on him. And I haven't talked about him on the podcast. I haven't read a lot of Lincoln books recently, but most of my childhood, adolescence, I love the man. I thought he was amazing. And I have to say, truly, and I'm not saying this just because I'm talking to you, I've recommended your book and things like that. I think it's one of the best books on Lincoln because it's not a strict history book. It's not a book on one of his speeches. And there's plenty of fantastic books on all of those things. But it's basically doing moral philosophy. And it's basically seeing Lincoln as a moral philosopher, which is incredible. It's incredible. I love, as I was telling you, the long form, your book's 800 pages. And it's. I wish it was 1,600. It's great. There's so much good stuff in here, and so I'm really just thrilled to talk with you. Of course, big privilege, big honor, but really get in the weeds of all of these really complex issues. I'll say, rereading it the past couple of weeks. Oh man, I read this when it came out in the Obama years. Rereading this now in our current climate has been very, very, very interesting. So, a lot of things are still apropos, for better or for worse. So we'll get all into it. Before we do, just tell listeners who you are professionally, academically, and all the relevant details there.
Well, I'm a professor of English at Brandeis, where I've taught since 1983.
Very nice.
I am not that far from retirement. I I have to say I'm having as much fun in the classroom as I ever had, but Brandeis is on to me, and they know if there is an onerous committee assignment, I won't say no to it. So really the only way I'll ever have a minute's peace is to retire. They say,
that's encouraging, though. It's encouraging to hear that you're still loving teaching, though.
I think the classes I have this spring are among the very best I've ever had. And
it's great.
It's not true that students have gotten worse. If at least
I agree.
At least I don't feel that way. I feel that the students I have now are at least as good as the best students I had in the past.
I agree. I actually really like the new generation. I think that they have this thing, in some sense, they're very inquisitive, but there's some general pessimism in the world, which, you probably pick up any decade and say that, but there is this kind of hopefulness that you can see as a glimmer that comes through. And I really, really love that.
They're curious and they want to understand things, and they don't just want to score points.
Yeah.
Which is a bad thing in discussions, is when people just want to score points.
I agree.
And that's just not true of students that I teach now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. So let me ask you. So you're not, I guess, a historian proper. You teach English, which I think is actually great for the content of which the book is. How did you come to just briefly? How did you come to write this book on this period, and really using your skill set and what you're coming to the table with, and approaching the topic in the way that you did? Yeah, what was the motivation, and did it just kind of start to, I'll write a 200-page or however many words, and then it just kept sprawling and sprawling and sprawling? Like how did that come apart?
Well, in the deep background of it, my father is from Freeport, Illinois, which is the site of one of the most important of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Mm-hmm. And Lincoln always mattered enormously to him. And he was, of course, a very tall guy from Illinois, so I always thought of him as Lincoln in a way. And my brothers say they hear my father's voice an awful lot in what I say in this book, so it's been in there.
That's nice.
And of course, I was growing up in the Vietnam generation, and he was from the New Deal generation. So part of my book is saying, Dad, I think you were much righter than I was in those days.
That's very nice.
Another part of this book is, my first book was about Robert Penn Warren, the author of All the King's Men, the great novel about American politics.
Yeah.
And as I was preparing the Warren book, I read a very little book that he wrote called The Legacy of the Civil War, which is, it's only 120 pages, but it's among the most insightful things I've ever read about the Civil War. David Blight recently singled it out for admiration in his book about the Civil War centennial. It's about the only good thing that happened during the centennial in Blight's book, is that Warren published that book. So as I was finishing my Warren book, I had a chapter on Warren's depiction of Lincoln, on Warren's response to Lincoln's speeches. And I started sketching out this book as I was finishing my Warren book. And always while I was writing it, I thought I would explain to people who asked me what I was doing. I'd say, I'm writing the book Robert Penn Warren would have written about Lincoln had he written a book about Lincoln. Now, as it happened, because I wasn't a historian, I had to spend an awful lot of time gaining insight into material that I'd really only had in a secondary way. So I spent many, many years reading and trying to catch up on the extremely voluminous literature about Lincoln. And I read in particular Harry Jaffe's book, Crisis of the House Divided, to which my book is a reply and a critique, but not, I would say, a refutation. I would say I learned a lot from Jaffe, and I criticized Jaffe a lot. I had originally, in my original conception of the book, I had an idea of what politics and political argument was like that I had picked up really out of Hannah Arendt's book on revolution.
Yeah, love it. Love Hannah Arendt.
And my original draft of the book, which I worked on for a long time, was very, very saturated with Arendt. And then I realized that a lot of the stuff that I was getting from Arendt was stuff that was also in Habermas. And behind both Arendt and Habermas was Rawls. So I rewrote the book really foregrounding Rawls, where I had foregrounded the others. I should also say this book has been much longer. When it went to the press, it was 1,500, not 800 pages long.
Wow, I didn't know that. Wow. Wow.
And there were large chapters on all sorts of strange subjects that are marginally connected with Lincoln. Also, this book took me 27 years to write.
Wow.
Partly because every theme depended on every other theme, so it was hard to figure out where to start. I tell people that had John Keats been born just after I started writing this book, he would have died before I finished it.
Well, I want the director's cut of the 1,500 pages. Let me get to Harvard University Press and yell at them for making you trim this down. So,
well, they made me cut it before they accepted the final manuscript.
There it is. I remember reading the parts in there of Hannah Arendt, obviously, and she's brilliant in a lot of ways. I like Hannah because she pisses off everybody equally almost. So
Exactly.
She's such an independent thinker, truly. But Rawls is great too. I had you might know him. He teaches down in Australia, but I had him on the podcast maybe a year or so ago. Oh boy, and of course I'm forgetting the name of the book, but Alexander Lefebvre. He wrote a book on liberalism. Liberalism as a way of life. That's the name of the book.
What a great title.
Yeah. Yes. And we're both moderate liberals, and so but we had a really a great conversation, but we had some small points of difference that we kind of wrestled over, which was really lovely. And he's like obsessed and like a big Rawls fan, like big time. And so in rereading the book, your book recently, and seeing Rawls pop up, I couldn't help but think about his book and my conversation with him not that long ago. So of course, he's the Rawls scholar, and I'm not, but I'm a little bit more steeped in Rawls, and so I'm sure we'll talk about him as well today.
Good.
So that's great. Let me just ask this: I'll ask this at the end again, but this incredible title. It's an incredible title. Maybe just don't fully answer it, but just kind of whet our appetites here, and then at the end of the conversation we can fully answer it. But what is Lincoln's tragic pragmatism? Or said in another way, what is it about the debates true debates that Lincoln and Douglas have that teach us about moral conflict, a liberal republic, and how to have these persuasive engagements? I mean, there's something so truly, I think in the best way, I don't think it's only this way, but in the best way, such a really wonderful piece of like American history there of like, we debate, we have this exchange of ideas. It's a liberal republic. Like, how do these debates teach us about moral conflict, and how that ties in with this tragic pragmatism? Tell us about this to start us off.
First, let me start by what I mean by tragic pragmatism, because the title actually might be a little bit deceptive, because you might read that title as critical. It is tragic that Lincoln was pragmatic. He should have been more principled. He could have had his way. We'd be a better republic, blah, blah, blah. That isn't at all the argument of my book. The argument of my book is that Lincoln understood that every solution he proposed to the problems he faced was likely to be partial, likely to be temporary, and likely to be flawed. And that what he represents is the possibility of acting responsibly in the face of political crossfire, in the face of unanticipated consequences, and in the face of morally compromised means. Oftentimes we imagine ourselves as, one of the reasons why we say calling somebody a politician is usually a term of abuse rather than a term of praise. Because we imagine, oh, they have dirty hands, and we would, of course, imagine it quite cleanly, imagine ourselves as quite cleanly. And the more I thought about the problems Lincoln was facing, it occurred to me that no serious political problem can actually be solved with clean hands. And, if I were Dante, the people who keep their who keep their hands clean would wind up in limbo, where Dante says, "Let us just look on them and pass on and not mention any of their names." So
this is the tragedy, is that
right,
it's not
exactly.
clean. Right.
Exactly. And you have to accept that your methods are going to be partial and they're going to be flawed. And they're going to be full of unanticipated consequences. And you're never going to be able to make the decision as clearly and unambiguously as you intended it to be. I was thinking, what I had in mind for Tragic Pragmatism is what Lincoln described in the famous Hodges letter in 1864. And maybe I should explain what the Hodges letter is.
Sure.
The Hodges letter was written to 3 editors from Kentucky. Important because they were Union loyal editors from a slave state. A slave state that Lincoln was very worried about, particularly when he was contemplating the Emancipation Proclamation. And you may recall that he had earlier vetoed 2 things that were kind of like Emancipation Proclamations from earlier generals because he thought they might lead Maryland and Kentucky to secede, and that would make the war impossible to win. So when he did issue the Emancipation Proclamation, naturally, many Kentucky Unionists thought, well, wait a minute, this isn't the bargain we entered into when we agreed to defend the Union. You had promised us in the first inaugural that you were going to leave slavery alone where we are. And the Emancipation Proclamation puts us in a complicated position. I should point out that one of those editors was the guy who persuaded Stephen Douglas to jump for the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. It caused the whole crisis to begin with. So it was rather a surprise that he turned out to be a pro-Lincoln Republican in the end. Just another weird surprise. Judge LeCompte, the bad guy in the Kansas crisis, also became a Republican during the Civil War.
Interesting.
Doesn't that amaze you?
Very amazing.
The worst pro-slavery bad guy in the bleeding Kansas crisis was Union loyal and became a Republican. At any rate, what Lincoln wrote to the editors in the Hodges letter was, "I have always been anti-slavery. I've always thought it was wrong. And I always thought that if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong." So he says from very early on, he had a strong but private moral conviction against slavery. But, he says, when he ran for the president, his job was, well, first to win the election, but second, to keep a union together that had divided opinions about slavery and fraught conflicts about slavery. And he argued he knew as president, under most circumstances other than the exceedingly extraordinary circumstances of civil war, where he could invoke an Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure, under the circumstances of normal politics, he would have not had the power to abolish slavery, because that would have taken a constitutional amendment, and that would have required a 3/4 vote, and there was absolutely no way that would have happened. So he had, in adopting the public role as a president, he had to not immediately listen to his private conscience on the subject of slavery. And you can see how instantly this raises hackles in people's mind. How can you be moral and a politician at the same time if you sell your soul at the door, as he does at this moment? But of course, there's a difference between responding to your conscience and responding as the leader of democracy, because I can command my conscience, but I can't command yours. And if I have if you allow me to rule, that means that I have to win your agreement. Otherwise, what I'm engaging in is tyranny, although maybe high-minded tyranny, or coercion, though maybe high-minded coercion. That means I have to persuade you. I can't just say how it's going to be. So he realized that once the South had seceded, once the slave states had seceded, his primary job was to restore the Union. He took a different view of his primary job later in the war, but he had been elected to preserve and restore the Union, and he had to cut as good a deal for his conscience as he could to restore the Union, which means he could not do something that would make Maryland and Kentucky secede. However, he also realized that in wartime, if it is required to save the Union to end slavery, then he can end slavery to save the Union. But, he says, I can't be motivated just by my primary hostility to slavery. I have to be motivated by my public responsibility to save the Union. And what he discovered in 1862 was that an attack on slavery was not just legal within the bounds of his wartime authority, but necessary in order to save the Union at all. Of course, and that's an important distinction. Otherwise, the Supreme Court might have overruled the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, what had changed is it became clear to him that Maryland and Kentucky would not secede at that point in the war. And I think the big lesson for him was the Battle of Antietam made it clear that Maryland was not going to secede. When Lee invaded Maryland, Maryland did not secede, and Maryland farmers did not tell him where the U.S. Army was. And indeed, as we were saying before the recording began, Barbara Fritchie kept up her flag and made it clear to President Lincoln where Maryland's loyalty stood.
I'll cut in here and just say, as a proud Marylander, this part of history always makes me feel very proud. It really does. It really, really does.
Now, it might have been a slightly different story had Lee invaded the Eastern Shore, but
yeah, but
that's a different Maryland.
we love all of our Marylanders, but I'm glad he came on the Antietam side, and yes, not on the Eastern side.
Yes. So that meant it was safe, but it had to be more than safe for him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. What he could say is, I make war on the chief economic power of the South by emancipating slaves, and that's true. But that isn't what he argued in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He could also say, I encourage the slaves to rise against their masters, but he very carefully did not say that, because he felt that would encourage the British and the French to intervene in the war, and that would have been bad news too. What he said is, he also had a motivation that he didn't say in the speech, but which he had said privately to his cabinet before, which is he was actually very angry with Maryland and Kentucky for not agreeing to a plan of emancipated compensation. He had written their governors a letter that said, you know as well as I do that that this war, by the mere presence of U.S. armies around the plantations, will end slavery wherever it goes, and that the mere friction and abrasion of war will destroy it. Why don't you accept a compensated emancipation plan while you can, so it will hurt your people less, your white people less? And they wouldn't do it because they weren't willing to take the risk. So curiously, one of the reasons he adopted the Emancipation Proclamation was to put pressure on Maryland.
That's all right. That's all right. That's okay, though. That's okay.
Now, when he announced that plan back in June of 1862, before Antietam, his cabinet surprisingly was for it. Even the conservatives in his cabinet were for it, which I think must have caught him by surprise. But Secretary Seward, who was, had a reputation as being a strongly anti-slavery member of his cabinet, said, as long as the Army of the Potomac keeps being defeated, the British and the French will interpret an Emancipation Proclamation as a desperation move, and it might provoke them to intervene. Seward said wittily, the American president making a declaration against slavery would be received the same way as the Pope making a bull against a comet. So Lincoln agreed to keep the Emancipation Proclamation in his desk until there was a victory. And of course, what happened between him putting it in his desk and Antietam was the 7 Days battles and Second Bull Run, which were all pretty bad experiences for the U.S.
Yeah.
And it's fair to say Antietam is pretty marginal as a victory. If Antietam counts as a victory, just about anything does. But it was enough for him to issue the proclamation. The key about the proclamation to me is the rationale he did for offering it. And the rationale was, we need to raise more soldiers to fight the Confederacy. And if we emancipate the slaves, we deprive the Confederacy of those soldiers who are digging trenches for them, not fighting. And we provide lots of new soldiers for our army. Now, that has the advantage of an argument that it's an unanswerable argument, because if you deny it, you're unpatriotic. You want to prevent our army from having soldiers?
Yeah.
The other advantage is it really does talk to a crying necessity, which you have to answer. So Justice Taney can't say, oh, this is just an ad hoc rationalization. It's for real. And, the Emancipation Proclamation was not overturned.
No.
And here's, I think, the cunning part. If the rationale is you recruit black people into the U.S. Army, that makes emancipation permanent.
Yeah.
Because you can't return to slavery people into whose hands you have put rifles. Okay? And Lincoln was pretty blunt about that in later speeches. I'm thinking of a speech, a letter he wrote to a man named Erastus Corning in 1864, that it was very important to imagine that the emancipation was irreversible. The other thing, and this he didn't say, but I think this is in the back of his mind, is that making people soldiers is an unparalleled way to forward the claim that they are citizens and have a right to the franchise. Now, Lincoln never said that until the very end of the war, but I think he could not but have had that in his mind. And in the Corning letter that I had just mentioned, he makes a very pointed comparison between union-supporting but squeamish anti-emancipation unionists who are carping and not helping to save the Union, a union which has been threatened by people who wish to allow the bullet to overrule the ballot. That was Lincoln's phrase. And all of these black soldiers who, even though they don't have the ballot, are risking their lives to preserve the sanctity of the ballot. That seems to be a not completely explicit but unmistakably powerful argument for black suffrage. And so my argument is that throughout the war, Lincoln is laying down predicates for positions he intends to take but wishes to preserve plausible deniability about. At the beginning of the war, the statement, I am not for attacking slavery where it is, but because I don't have the constitutional power to do so, but only for keeping it from expanding into the Western territories, that was true. But Lincoln understood that keeping slavery out of the Western territories would undermine it and would lead to its ultimate extermination. So it was true, but it was also plausible deniability for a further aim. So here, I think the argument of I wish to emancipate slaves to be able to recruit black soldiers is true, but it's also a claim about a further goal that he has preserved plausible deniability about. And those are examples of what I want to call a tragic pragmatism.
I mean, you laid it out very nicely, and it is something that for me, I'm beat up all the time as again, a moderate liberal. I'm very much a pragmatist in my politics, and I think I have a friend of mine that we've talked about this a lot. The road to progressivism and progressive ideals is through political pragmatism, and that's how I see it, and that's how I think other people see it as well. A few follow-up things here that as you were laying out the kind of main thesis of the book and the argument, is a few things that came to mind as you were saying this. No, one of them is, we could jump to right now, and for many folks that have what we would say, small L and capital L liberal politics, it does seem very activist based and very emotively based, and the pragmatism piece, again, it's a different time, is super essential to get things done. I mean, you can look at LBJ also has an element of this as well in the 60s.
Exhibit A.
Yeah, I mean, it really does. So there's that piece, right? Also, hearing all of these things. I mean, anybody that has a nominal understanding of Abe Lincoln knows the guy is from. I mean, he's basically a backwoods guy. Like he's from born in Kentucky, raised in Illinois. He's down in Louisiana. He's in it's just he's I mean, poor, very poor. In the middle of the 19th century, early 19th century, and it's just like he's self-taught essentially on most things. How did he come to have such a high IQ politically? How did he just know people? Like, the foresight to do all of this is pretty spectacular. I mean, I have to say. And then the other thing about this is this whole thing, which I think is so important. I really do. It's, again, another angle of the pragmatism piece. You can have your private opinions, but if you're in public office, your public opinions, because you're for and representative of, for an office, but for other people that you're representing, that is going to be different. It's not just going to be about you. It has to be bigger than that, right? And I think that's key. And the final thing I'll say here is this idea of, I sort of said in the beginning, this, we debate ideas. When you live in a liberal pluralism, right, society, right, a pluralistic society where what Oregon doesn't have to be the same thing that Alabama doesn't have to be the same thing that Maine does. There's something about that where you can use that in different ways. But I think one of the things that makes historically in theory is the United States different in the modern age. Is this idea of truly free speech and debate and persuasion through arguments, not tyranny, not all of the authoritarianism, not all of these things. That's what other countries have done, and that doesn't make us better per se, but for a while, that was the thing that set us apart, I would say. And Lincoln again is saying that and modeling that. So all these things are popping up as you're saying that. You can try and weave that together or take it any way you want, but yeah, just how do we see all of these themes come out of this kind of pragmatism that he was using politically?
Well, I think the first thing I want to point out is that as I was writing this book, there was a great change in the climate of public opinion going on the subject of equal marriage for gay and straight people. And I was very aware that President Obama was acting with the same kind of indirection that President Lincoln was acting. Oh, I'm for what was the phrase that was short of marriage? What was it called? Civil unions.
Civil union,
yeah. I'm not for marriage. I'm for civil unions. I'm for this and for that. And President Obama engaged in a great deal of indirection, partly because he didn't want to upset the apple cart, and mess up the possibility that was there. There was I thought the very funny moment where Vice President Biden just said it straight out,
Right.
and all President Obama could say is, "Well, Joe got out in front of his skis there."
Right. Right.
But he couldn't say I disagreed with him because he didn't.
Right. Right. Right.
That in Lincoln's case, he really did not want to make any move that he would have to take back. And that's one of the reasons why he was so extremely cautious, because it would have been a worse situation to make a move and have to take it back, because that would have discredited the possibility for the next generation.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why he laid the groundwork so carefully over those 2 years.
But is this a temperament thing? Is this a person, an IQ thing? I mean, how does he know how to do this?
Actually, that is kind of wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because sociologically, Lincoln came from a class and a region where he should have been a great racist.
Of course. Yes.
His politics should have been, he could have been a unionist, but he would have been a great racist.
Right.
I mean, the person whose background most resembles his is Andrew Johnson. And the ways that Johnson's politics, Andrew Johnson, not Lyndon Johnson, though I want to get to Lyndon in a minute.
Yeah.
Yeoman, non-slaveholding farmers like Johnson, who really was from the other side of the tracks. Johnson did not learn how to read until after he was married. He was taught how to read by his wife. They frequently were at least as racist as the non-slaveholders, like Andrew Johnson, were frequently as racist as the slaveholders. They hated the slaveholders who lorded over them, but they treated the black people as the emblem of the slaveholders' power. And for them, racism was an expression of their class resentment against the master class. And although they were unionists and although they fought the master class, they frequently were harsher racists. Because the master class's racism was frequently a hierarchical kind of racism. Oh, we loves our people. We take cares of our people. They loves us, blah, blah, blah. A certain amount of wishful thinking and projection and narcissism and dreaming in that. But they would very rarely cop to being straightforward race-hatred racists. In the 19th century, working class people, South and North, tended to be bitter race-hatred racists. The more you were for universal white manhood suffrage, the more likely you were to imagine black people as less than human. That's just the bitter irony of 19th century politics.
Yeah.
And those were Andrew Johnson's politics. That's why Johnson expected that the former slaves would be the tools of their masters during Reconstruction. That seems like a totally insane theory to us.
Yeah.
The irony of it is, this is the point of C. Van Woodward's book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, is that black voters were not completely disfranchised at the end of Reconstruction. A rump group of black voters continued to hold the vote until the 1890s. And the reason is that they were the balance of power between the Bourbon class, the former slaveholders, and the yeoman populist class. And they were a very conservative voting bloc. They did vote with their former masters because they knew who to be afraid of. And that's why when the populists came in the 1890s, among the very first things they did was completely disfranchise the black people and impose formal racial segregation. So there's a word for that kind of class and race-bound politics. The word for it is Herrenvolk democracy, where the rich white and the poor white act in concert despite their conflicts with each other, because the poor white uses whiteness to extort respect from the rich white, and the rich white uses whiteness to keep the poor white in line. If you defect, I'm going to call you an N-lover, and so on and so on. Now, this strategy of Herrenvolk democracy explains why it is that the poor white so long voted against his interest. And that view survives to this day in what we now call the replacement theory, right? Which is a Herrenfolk democratic theory. The alliance between rich conservatives and working class people over the issue of racism, and the powerful argument that the sort of politics of rich people employs against poor people, saying, look, it's the underclass, it's the black people, it's the immigrants, it's the newly upwardly mobile women. They're taking all your jobs, and those liberals are in a conspiracy to advance them at your expense.
Yeah.
And that was still very much the politics of the white yeoman class in those days. If you've read Huckleberry Finn, you may remember Pap Finn gives this tirade about how he never wants to vote because black people have the vote. In the 1840s, when that book is supposed to be set, that's nonsense. Black people didn't have the vote almost anywhere except Massachusetts and New York. But that's strictly an argument about 1880s Herrenfolk democracy. And Pap Finn is the portrayal, his politics, not his alcoholism or his child abuse, but his politics are the Herrenfolk politics of the South of that time and of much of the North, of the politics of Southern Illinois and Southern Indiana and Southern Ohio. It's the politics of South Boston during the desegregation crisis. And that should have been Lincoln's politics. And that it wasn't Lincoln's politics, I think, has to do with the lucky accident that he was Lincoln. Maybe it has to do with the lucky accident that his father took him out of Kentucky, but I think it mostly has to do with the lucky accident that he was Lincoln. That's what separated him from his class and his group.
It's interesting about that because I remember there was it's really, really interesting because you saying this, really brings up this idea you bring later in the book. So I'll bring it here because since it's germane to what you're saying, is this idea that Lincoln had, where he was trying to in the I'm jumping ahead, but you can bring it here because it'll be nice. Is the essence of a house divided against itself can't stand? The key phrase, and how one should perceive slaveholders, and how that speech pushed for this pragmatic adjustment, and that he knew that we needed moderate Southerners for a unified Union. You can talk about that, but do you think some of that psychologically is Lincoln knew those people, right?
Yes, I do.
He knew that those are
he married them for one thing.
Well, that. But these are the people I grew up with, or people around that grew up with, and they had these ideas, and that you can't only demonize. If you have to unify, you have to be able to look at some of the pragmatics there, even though they're seeing black folks, they own them, they saw them less than humans or animals even. But even still doing that, saying, how do we work with these people? Yeah, maybe we can bring this here because it's kind of irrelevant it's relevant to what you're saying. How does that work here?
Oh, okay, I think I know where you're going.
Yeah.
The first point you made is, of course, he knew these people. Mary Todd Lincoln was such a person, right. And Joshua Speed was such a person, and those were the people who mattered most to him emotionally in his whole life. Speed and Mary. But I think I think the place where you really see it is not in the House Divided speech, which I actually think is a rather inflammatory speech, but in the Peoria speech. And there he imagines a reasonable slaveholder with whom he hopes to be able to strike a deal.
Yeah.
Now he has in mind the primordial progenitor of people like Joshua Speed, which is to say Thomas Jefferson and Henry Clay. Jefferson knows very well that slavery is wrong, but doesn't know how to free himself of it. Partly because he's in debt, so he doesn't actually even own his slaves, and partly because he's not actually a very good manager in money, so he can't stay out of debt. I mean, so he's not totally home free, But he at least did understand the subject well enough to say in Notes Toward a State of Virginia, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. And he did know it well enough to include this furious philippic against slavery in the Declaration of Independence, not just the promise of the opening sentences, but a very furious attack on slavery in the Declaration. And more than that, it was not just Jefferson, but it was the Virginia legislature that made sure that slavery stayed out of the region north of the Ohio River. It wasn't New England that insisted on the Northwest Ordinance's action against slavery. The Virginia legislature made a condition of ceding the Northwest territories to the Union, made it a condition that slavery never go there, which means they understood that once they had become slaveholders, there was no going back. That slavery has a magnetic imprisoning hold on the economies of the states that have it, and a magnetic imprisoning hold on the psychologies of the people who engage in it. And given the choice, they would rather the old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, they would just as soon that slavery not go there. Although slavery was already there in Illinois because the French had brought it there. So he sees people like this, mostly Upper South slaveholders, like Jefferson, and particularly Clay, his great idol as a young man growing up. Clay spends a great deal of time trying to end slavery in Kentucky, never successfully. Clay speaks against slavery. And from Clay's point of view, the Compromise of 1850 is an anti-slavery thing. Although I think from our point of view now, we think of it as a pro-slavery thing. But Clay thinks of himself as trying to keep alive the possibility that slavery will end. Now, those guys have already made an important concession, which is to say, I know that slavery is morally wrong, and I want to find the practical conditions that will make it not suicidal for me to give it up. Remembering that slaves are the largest capital investment in the United States. So a very hard thing to give up. With those people, you can make a pragmatic compromise because you could say, if you've conceded that slavery is wrong, then you concede that it shouldn't survive forever. And we can take little piecemeal measures to wear it away until it goes away, which is the fantasy Lincoln had entertained straight into the beginning of the war. Lincoln says of those people, about slaveholders, having these people in mind, people like, I should say, a kind of slaveholder that had really lost all his power in the South. Part of the tragedy of the South is the replacement of Henry Clay by John C. Calhoun as the representative Southern politician. That's why when Georgia plantation owners were burned out by Sherman's army, they said, all right, you have to do that to me, but be sure you do the same when you get to South Carolina. They got us into this.
I mean, they fired the first shot, didn't they?
Exactly. You may remember what a famous South Carolina Unionist, there were South Carolina Unionists, said about South Carolina. South Carolina is too small to be an independent republic and too large to be a lunatic asylum.
That's very funny.
At any rate, in the Peoria speech, which is Lincoln's speech against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he says, these slaveholders did not ask for slavery. They were born into it. And they were already tied up in it almost beyond their power to untie it. Now, there were people who did, Cassius Clay, for instance, but most people don't. And politics is about what's going to be doable for most people, not for the morally heroic. He says, I can't judge them because they didn't ask for it, they don't like it, and I myself don't have a good idea about how to get rid of it. And he lays out 3 or 4 possibilities. Do we want to emancipate them and make them equal? Ultimately, what he did do, but he says, they won't accept that. And he says he couldn't accept it. Now, he isn't proud of having ugly racial feelings, But he notices that those, and he says that he has rather uglier racial feelings than I think he really did have. But his concession is, his argument is, an unjustified feeling, even if it's extremely powerful, you can't just wipe away. You have to scratch it away bit by bit. Another possibility is, well, maybe they can emigrate somewhere. What's known as colonization. Well, that's a very ugly solution. When Jefferson proposes colonization, what he has in mind is essentially ethnic cleansing.
Yep.
And he wants involuntary, forced emigration to Africa. And Lincoln thinks that's barbaric. In the first place, they'd starve. In the second place, they're not Africans.
Right.
Not anymore. Right. Clay, who is the leader of the American Colonization Society, sees it slightly differently. He supports colonization not to rid the U.S. of black people, but to rid the black people of white racism. Clay's argument is they will never be free and happy as long as we're going to be bullying them, and they'll probably do better where we're not there to beat them up. That's a slightly different argument that Clay makes. Mm-hmm. Not a totally savory argument, but better than Jefferson's. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Clay also goes one step further. He says, furthermore, once they get to to Africa, because they're Americans, they're going to bring democracy to Africa with them. That was his claim. So he essentially sees them as colonials, as colonizers. Now, that's a problematic view too, right?
It certainly is.
And we see how that worked out in Liberia, where the Americo-Liberians sort of were colonizers.
Yes, yes.
So one way or another, colonization is not going to be a working proposition. Lincoln knows it's impractical from the beginning, but he embraces it almost to the very end, mostly as a way of shutting up critics. You know, what are you going to do with all those freed people? How are we going to live with them? Oh, I'm going to export them to Africa. Well, I think mostly that's a strategic evasion on Lincoln's part. He did try it in a very half-hearted way. He threw it in the leader of the black community's face in the summer of 1862 when he had the Emancipation Proclamation in his desk. But I think that deep down, Lincoln knew that wasn't going to fly, and it probably wasn't a good idea.
Yeah.
Curiously, that strategy, that desire continued into the Grant administration. There was what was called, during the Civil War, there was something called the Blair Plan, put forward by Montgomery Blair, who was a unionist from Maryland who was in Lincoln's cabinet. And Blair's attitude was, American black people know about democracy. Central Americans don't. Let's colonize Central America with American slaves and kill two birds with one stone. A lunatic plan.
It's a wild plan.
President Grant pursued a similar plan where they were going to buy Santo Domingo and make it an American colony. And the president of the Dominican Republic appeared willing to sell, but I still think that was probably some kind of elaborate con. But fortunately, Grant was never able to make this happen. I think he woke up to the fact that it was probably a con. So in the Peoria speech, Lincoln rules out equality because people won't accept it, rules out colonization because it's impractical, and he says, so do we want to emancipate them and keep them as a permanent subject underclass? And Lincoln says, no, I don't want that either, and I'm not even certain that improves their condition. And, remember, I mean, I still think being a sharecropper is a whole hell of a lot better than being a slave, but it's not like being an equal citizen, and it's really not sustainable in the long term. So Lincoln argues, since I don't really know what I'm going to do about slavery. I'm not going to demand that it immediately end, only that you do the things that will buy us time to end it and buy us time to think of a better solution. That's what he argues in the Peoria speech. As God is my witness, I don't know what I would do about slavery, even if I had every power to end it tomorrow, he says at that speech, which is a remarkably generous speech, but only possible if he's addressing slaveholders like Jefferson or like Speed. The weakness of that speech is that wasn't what the majority of slaveholders believed, I think. It's what slaveholders in Kentucky believed, and what slaveholders in Maryland believed, but it's not what slaveholders believed in South Carolina or what they believed in Georgia.
I guess it's interesting because you're seeing how, well, I mean, I guess listeners you can hear, I mean, in some sense, practically or pragmatically, trying to do this and trying to fix this was, you could believe it's wrong morally all day, and that's fine. But that doesn't solve your problem politically with where things were in the climate, where things were economically. And as you said earlier, Lincoln didn't want to do something where, it gets erased or it just gets, torn up in the next administration, et cetera, et cetera. So really, Lincoln doing the hard thing that some people say the founder should have done. And he stood there and said, okay, let me figure this out. Let's try and figure this out. I mean, it's just, it almost seems like it's mission impossible. And I wonder if maybe this is a crazy thing to say, but I don't know if maybe it could have been done without the Civil War. I wonder that.
Obviously, historians have argued about that for generations.
Right.
So much so that it became a subject that was sort of off limits. I mean, usually the answer is you solve the problem with war. And there's lots of problems with that as a solution. In the first place, our attraction to violent solutions reflects a certain unrealism about what violence is like.
That's a nice way of saying it.
People approach war with joy and relief, particularly if they've been holding it off with unsavory, dirty hands compromises, because they think of violence as purifying, and because they think of it as morally affirming. But that isn't how war actually is. There's the famous statement by, who is it? Who wrote the famous book on war? Who am I thinking of?
The Art of War?
Yes, Clausewitz. No plan of battle survives the first moment of contact with the enemy. I think the other story is no imagination of oneself as a pure crusader wielding the sword of God survives the first moment of bloodshed. In the first place, you might lose the war. In the second place, you might give up everything that matters to you to win the war. You don't know what you become once you unleash violence. And the more morally pure you imagine yourself as a user of violence, the more dangerous you are. Think of the suicide bomber. Think of the terrorist. Think of the people who killed each other during the wars of religion. People with cynical ideas about going to war are very rarely going to engage in massacre politics because there's no money in it for them. Whereas the people who are going to really kill people are the people who believe they're serving God's will. And there's really nothing more dangerous on this earth than somebody who believes that God has licensed him to kill everybody who opposes him.
I fully agree with you on that. Fully agree.
And that's the big lesson of the Lincoln second inaugural address. That when you are moved to violence by the purest moral motives, the chances are you're going to be made demonic by your virtues. And what Lincoln is always being worried about is he has two worries. First, that he'll compromise away all of his moral authority, which is what everybody who dislikes Lincoln says. But he's also worried that if I wield the sword of God, I'm going to be worshiping myself with a louder voice. That's what my God is.
I guess,
and he wants to go between those things.
Yeah. So this is dipping into the more the moral philosophy part. So you make this. We can talk about this here because this is interesting. I want to get to liberalism, kind of abstractly, but before that, you mentioned early in the book, which I thought was interesting, and this is a bit more abstract, but we can use Lincoln in the story there as a kind of a case example. You mentioned that concepts are implicit, and I really sat with this for a while. I really like this. I like this, so we can get into it. You said that Lincoln has claimed that we ourselves are in the dark about our own values and aims. Now, I love this. I love this. I've read a lot of philosophy. I totally agree with it. It is a deep and profound thought, even more deep that Lincoln said this. And you say that it's a type of reverse Burkeanism, right? So Edmund Burke is like his father of conservatism, which, let me just a footnote here. A lot of conservatives nowadays, to distance or to not align themselves with the far right and the MAGA movement and all the things that are going on now with the Republican Party, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, will say, well, I'm an old school conservative, and I'm really just, this kind of Burkeanism, right? Which, okay. I mean, I guess, in the abstract or as ideas, it's fun to talk about or whatever. But how is this idea of concepts being implicit, of not knowing our true values or aims, how are all these things a type of reverse Burkeanism, and how did Lincoln try to wrestle with this concept?
All right, first I want to talk about implicitness of concepts.
Yeah.
Then about Burkeanism, because I have some good things to say about it. It's a bad
I
thing
do
to say
too.
about
Yes, I'm also that way. Yeah.
Reverse Burkeanism.
Yeah.
By implicitness of values, I guess the way through that is to invoke the distinction that H.L.A. Hart made in his book, The Concept of Law, between a law's concept and a law's conception. Now, those sound like two versions of the same thing, right? But the difference is this. When we create a law, we have an idea of what it's supposed to mean, of what value it's supposed to affirm, of what its ultimate purpose is. Mm-hmm. But we can never fully articulate that. We always articulate it in terms of the conditions that prevail for us in the here and now. Mm-hmm. The history we're at the end of, the constraints under which we operate, the world of prejudices and interests that we have to negotiate to make it go. So we always enact a value in a way that does not completely reflect the meaning of that value. Probably the classic example of a tension between concept and conception. I mean, one way is that's crudely speaking, that's the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution. We stand for all these values in the first sentences of the Declaration, but to make a republic out of it, we have to have the 3/5 compromise and the fugitive slave clause and all the other for that matter, the equal vote in the Senate, all those things that are still, I mean, the latter of those is still making problems for our democracy. But those were the conditions of it happening at all, so I can't complain too much about it. Better accept that than be still ruled under the Articles of Confederation.
Sure,
right?
sure.
So if you are loyal to a law, what is the ultimate object of your loyalty? Is it the conception or is it the concept? If you are what we call an originalist, you argue we only have access to the conception. The conception is a bargain. It's a deal. We agreed to it. We're bound by it. And we are bound as much by the founders' vices as we are by their virtues. That is, after all, the argument that Justice Taney made in the Dred Scott decision. I like to point this out, that Justice Taney is the true inventor of originalism. Because when Taney argues that under the Constitution, the black man has no rights which the white man is bound to respect, Tawney does not cite that as his own opinion. With a certain amount of crocodile tears, he says, oh, we don't believe that. We think that's unenlightened. We think that's cruel. But that's what the founding generation believed. Incidentally, that's false. Racial opinions hardened between the founding generation and Tawney's generation. But Tawney was able to adduce all sorts of, I think, not totally persuasive arguments that the founders were far more racist than he was. But Tawney's argument is we don't approve of that conception, but it's binding until we change it, and it hasn't been changed. And that is still the force of I don't want to say strict construction. I think, what was the word I was using?
Originalism.
Originalism.
Yeah.
The whole force of originalism is to give the founders' vices veto power over their virtues. I think that one of the ironies is that certain kinds of crabby progressive view it the same way. They say, this is what the Constitution is about, and therefore we shouldn't value it. This is what the founding values are about, therefore we shouldn't value it. Yeah. You know, it strikes me that the attack on Jefferson's hypocrisy is made by progressives in exactly the same way that it's embraced by conservatives.
Yeah, I agree.
That's one of the reasons Frederick Douglass changed his mind about the meaning of the Constitution, is that he came to the, you know, he had been with Garrison, somebody who'd thought of the Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. And then ultimately he said two things. First, what am I going to turn to if I don't have the Constitution on my side other than revolution? Second, it's better to have the Constitution with you than against you. And third, every bad thing I say about the Constitution is exactly what John C. Calhoun says, and there must be something wrong if I agree with him.
but I guess
I wanted to get back to implicitness here.
Yeah,
okay?
Please.
What Lincoln argues when he argues about what equality meant to Jefferson, you could take that he meant it in the extremely qualified sense that his life bears out. He owned slaves, he sold families away from he sold members of families away from each other, he had children by his slaves, blah, blah, blah. You could take it in that extremely compromised sense, which is how Stephen Douglas took it. Or you could say, what is Jefferson's deepest conviction, and what is the hostages he had to give to the here and now? And Lincoln's argument is, Jefferson knew and didn't know what his promise of equality meant what the promise of equality that he put in the opening sentences of the Declaration meant. He knew that meant slavery had to go, even if he couldn't make it go. He knew it meant all sorts of adjustments to the society. Why couldn't he make it equal? We don't have an equal society then or now. And as Lincoln said, it wasn't equal even among white people, never mind among white and black people then. So what Lincoln argues about Jefferson and freedom is that he understood that it is an idea that will unfold, and that is an idea that will keep putting pressure on the Republic until its conception does better justice to its concept. And that in changing the law, you look to reconceive the conception to do better justice to the underlying concept. And you recognize that concept has implications, some of which you don't see, but which will be obvious when they hit you in the face, and some of which you may even deny, but which will come to the condition where you will have to face up and face the music and change things. Obviously, Jefferson knew that there was something the matter with slavery, and in the long run it had to go. But he couldn't change it with a wave of his pen. Jefferson did not anticipate equality of women, and he certainly did not anticipate equality of sexual orientation or sexual identity.
Right.
So what I mean when I say that values have implicitness is that when you commit yourself to a value, you commit yourself to consequences of the underlying underlying concept that you don't know and can't anticipate, and that circumstances will bring to the fore in an utterly urgent way that is inevitable in retrospect and impossible in prospect. That's what I mean when I talk about the implicitness of concepts, that there's always more in them, that they're always larger than your theories of them are.
Let me. Yeah. So, totally agree. So let me jump in here with how I'm seeing this. For me, a lot of the times when people ask or when people will discuss, well, what are your values, right? So if we take something very basic like this is right or wrong, or this is good or evil or bad, whatever, right? My belief is, and this isn't a novel belief of mine, other people have thought this too, but this resonates with me, is we don't care really when we ask that question about one's value system, right? What we care is the intention behind the values. That's what we care about. When you really work it out and you say, well, it's wrong to steal, or it's wrong to assault somebody, or it's good to help somebody, whatever your moral value system is, you're not actually caring on the face of it the right or wrongness of something, because those things are so subjective in a large part of it, right? And people debate that. But what you're really asking is, what is your intention? That's what we care about. And to your point, right, is you can have, so this is a little bit of kind of my world coming into this of sorts with psychology, is I think that there's a lot of things with humans that can change. You can change your worldview, your values, your beliefs, your ideas, feelings change, obviously. All of these things change. But I think a lot of the things that don't change are things that are nestled deep within us, deep within our temperament, our psyche. And a lot of the times we can't know, even with ourselves. It's like there's a locking mechanism. And until you're in a certain situation, or you're in a certain environment, or with a certain person or whatever, you find this uncovering, this unveiling, this unlocking of within yourself. And so if you're only beholden to whatever your moral values are in that instance, well, number one, I think it's not really asking what we care about. What we really care about is what's your intention. And if you can't know your intentions, because they're always going to be this unlocking or uncovering, there is this way of, we should not hold on to the face validity of a value or idea, but be more curious and investigative within ourselves about what other things we could uncover that's connected behind that value system. What do you think about this?
That was very exciting. I could not have said that better. That really is exactly what I have in mind, that we want to hold true to something in ourselves. We can't anticipate everything that's going to require of us.
Yep.
Sometimes events face us with them. As Lincoln said in the famous speech he gave January 1, 1863, that sometimes we face our destiny and we didn't know it was coming. Sometimes it's there. We know intuitively what's right, but we don't know exactly what the consequences of that intuition are, and we don't know what's going to suddenly seem totally obvious we have to do when it hits us in the face. That we don't entertain our deepest values as a set of propositions. We entertain them as an intuitive pull that's partly obscure to us, that events clarify when we find ourselves in the midst of them. That my word for that is the situatedness of values. I think that I might use that phrase might mean, oh, values depend on circumstances and therefore they aren't real. But that isn't what I meant by it. What I meant is sometimes I don't discover who I really am till life challenges me in a particular way.
I would also say that so much of, if you take an evolutionary perspective or from a biology perspective, and Freud talked about this in different ways, Darwin, other people talked about this, but it's this idea of when you scale it all the way to human psychology and things like that, I still think it's the underlying basic building block, which is this: much of life is instinctually based, yeah? And so we can't know it, right? We have these instincts, right? And we have the same stuff made up with all multicellular organisms. Okay, so we have our configuration that is humans, fine. But what we know is we have our instinct, and instinct is you try to define it, you try to understand it. That's hard to do. Okay, but we have it, and I would say a lot of the times we have an inversion of this. A lot of the times people bury their instinct, even though that has caused us to, all organisms on the planet, to evolve, to survive, to maximize, fitness for the next generation, genetically and evolutionary speaking, and yes, in terms of our humanity. But I think we reverse it. I think we should lead with instinct, but we have our instincts firmly rooted and grounded in really good cognitive wherewithal, where we can make good decisions, have good abstraction, be able to understand our morals. And we also are able to have it grounded and rooted in how we understand our emotional connectedness and our interdependence and our cooperation. And I think in that case, you're using the instinct as a way, the cognition and emotional pieces of who we are as humans is sort of the two kind of bilateral anchors that are steering our instinct of how to do things. Not we overemphasize cognition and maybe, or we overemphasize our emotional, censorious kind of, predilections, and we bury instinct. I think we have the inverse of this all the time. And I think if we did that a little bit more, and again, I think there's a probably continuum of this, but that could maybe help us to know that we don't always place an idea or a value we have in one moment over certain things or people, because we don't know what we could unlock with it. And if we listened slightly better to maybe what you're saying, the situationness of it, or maybe we have some of the more instinctual things of it that's really grounded, right? I'm not saying to, like you're saying, I'm not saying to lead with impulse or instinct. I'm saying that it can help us. It could be a good guide if it's really anchored in good rational thinking, good emotional ways of interacting with our social dynamics, things like that. I think that's much more helpful. And so you can keep going on that, but I guess the question I have on this is how did Lincoln try to do this with the slavery issue?
Okay. Yes. Okay. I want to pick up on one thing you just said before I get to that last question.
Yeah, please.
I think of what you're describing as very like what the Quakers call the inner light, which is to say, its sources are obscure, it's imperative, it's full of meaning, it's highly morally consequent, but exactly what it demands of us is not always clear from the beginning, and that we require actual contact with the world to know what it requires of us, and we sometimes have to manage our engagement with the world carefully in order to keep the possibility of the inner lights working possible. That's what pragmatism is about. We think of how Lincoln himself grew, right? Historians have always talked about Lincoln as a figure who grows in office. And that's not just that his views about race widen as he gets older, because they do. It isn't just that his views about what's possible for democracy widen as he gets older. It's that the basic values he had at the beginning under pressure of events, reveal deeper layers. As Jefferson both knew and did not know that what he believes about freedom entails the end of slavery, so Lincoln both knew and did not know that what he believed about equality entails true racial equality, not merely legal and political, but also social and psychological equality.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, he lived in a society that was unwilling to accept that. He had to distinguish between equality of human rights, equality of political rights, and social equality, because the first is the prerequisite of the second, and the second is the prerequisite of the third. And if people won't give the first because they know they're going to have to give the third, they're not going to give the first. I think the argument about people, well, first is, how do you do best justice to the founders' values? You do best justice to the founders' values by doing by answering the things about their values that would have made them ashamed. I serve Jefferson better by standing for racial equality than I do for standing for having children by your slaves. Which is more consistent with Jefferson? Obviously, it's the better things are more consistent with Jefferson. So reverse Burkeanism means I honor the founders not by imitating their conceptions, but by honoring their concepts. That to give their conceptions tyrannizing power over their concepts in the ways that originalism does, it is to betray those concepts, because every conception is an imperfect representation of its concept. What that means is that a concept is always alive and a little bit mysterious to us.
Yeah.
Roughly in the way another person is. If you think about other people, they're always larger than your theories about them.
Yeah.
The only people you have a complete theory about are the people you hate. The people you fight with in the comment strings on the blog pages. Those are the people you have a complete theory of. Because to have a complete theory about somebody is to have settled their hash and to finally have contempt for them. People who matter to you are always people whose story isn't over.
Yes, I firmly agree. Yes, I totally agree with that. There is an ever curious nature of someone you genuinely are interested in and you care about. I totally agree with you on that. Totally agree.
And the more you know about them, the more their case is still open and still rich.
1000% agree.
That's what relationship is. Is that curious balance between knowing and unknowing.
Yes.
That keeps the person you're with not somebody you've got under your thumb, not somebody whose verdict is in, not somebody whose hash you've settled. Now that's what Martin Buber calls a thou,
yes.
right?
Yeah. I thou, yeah.
And when I try to imagine a concept is also a thou, which is to say it has an inwardness I'm never going to fully exhaust.
Yes.
It has a power to rebuke me no matter how good I think I am. And the points where I'm most proud of myself for being the perfect American are usually the points where I'm about to do something really, really stupid. Because concepts also have this inexhaustible inwardness. The other side of this same thing is when I am absolutely certain I am serving my concept, I am likely to be betraying it. If I don't have the slightest bit of self-doubt about how I treat my values, then I'm a fanatic.
Yeah.
And then I kill what I love, which is what a fanatic does. Is he kills the thing he loves deepestly by loving it in a particularly in a way that has no implicitness in it.
Yeah, the thing with that there is that with fanatics is there's no it's all emotion based, it's all these things, and I think the opposite of that is you need to curate some form of epistemic humility about yourself and about the concepts or others that you care about.
And that's what Lincoln had. That was his secret, is that epistemic humility. That's why you never see self-righteous rage in him. Even with people he has reason to be self-righteously angry with.
Sure, yeah.
That's why he delivers in the second inaugural address that very peculiar remark that just because you have finally beaten the slave power, just because you have finally, at great cost, at the cost of, we now know, 800,000 lives, not the 600,000 lives we thought when I was writing my book, don't imagine that you are different in kind from the people you've beaten.
Yeah.
That's a very important lesson, right? That's the lesson. That's the lesson that gave the United States the Marshall Plan.
That's right.
That's why it matters that it was the U.S. that won the Cold War.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. I mean, but those things have a lot of currency. I mean, that's something that's so important to not miss.
And that's also important to realize that the person, of course, Lincoln realized that the people he's fighting are people who are not that morally different from him, and that his own case against them might be compromised by a certain kind of self-righteous moral narcissism that imagines I'm the good guy and you're not. Or that the fact that I'm right about this makes me right about everything. Robert Penn Warren called that the treasury of virtue.
That's a good way to phrase it, yeah.
And if you believe that Lincoln always tries to remember that sooner or later he's going to have to develop a common habit of life with the people he fights.
Yeah.
Now, the really strange thing about Lincoln, and this is the thing I still haven't figured out how he did it, is that usually if you recognize that you should not embrace a morally self-righteous vindictive rage, the alternative is to become a little weak, a little morally uncertain, and to be put in a position where the person who has the greater certainty is going to trample you. But Lincoln was capable of fighting the second deadliest conflict of the whole 19th century. Only the Taiping Rebellion was bloodier. Is capable of carrying on a war of absolutely hyperbolic violence with a people he nevertheless refuses to hate and recognizes that when it's over, he's going to have to live with them.
It's such a paradox almost. I mean, it's
who does that but Lincoln?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to really kind of understand.
I can say somebody who did. Truman did.
Yeah.
He dropped the bomb on the Japanese, and then he lived with the Japanese and gave the very mild and very forgiving American occupation of Japan. And I mean, so that's really a version of the same paradox. He was willing to fight absolutely unlimited war. Yet he was also willing to see that the other guy ultimately is a human being who deserves to be treated as a human being and deserves not to be treated as a villainous cartoon we can point to when we want to say that at least we're not as bad as that guy.
Well, it's just interesting because, it reminds me of this other thing that you discussed in the book that I was really, again, struck by. I thought about this a lot too, is one can only claim freedom one is willing to recognize in others. And one is free only insofar as one shares that freedom with others in this culture of persuasion and consent. So to put it another way, when one person or group denies the freedom of others, you lose it for yourself. There's
Exactly.
this inexplicable connection and reciprocity there. So we can talk about this further, but you also say about this promise of equality differs from just morals and moral requirements, right? Because this reciprocity, there's this essence of democratic political ideals, and you can't have even democracy without it. So how do we ride this kind of reciprocity here on this with equality and freedom?
Well, I guess I would start with Buber and say I can't really be an I except if I'm engaged with the thou for whom I have to be the I. But I'd say that even Buber's language goes back to Kant, which is to say, when I engage morally with another person, I recognize that that other person is an end in themselves, and that other person has inwardness, has agency, has identity. And if I treat that other person as a thing, I also treat that person as incapable of giving me recognition. Because for me to be human, I also have to be recognized by the other. I guess the model for that is really not citizenship, but love, right? That the person you love has to be other, but also has to be the other for whom you are yourself. And I think there's something of the model of citizenship in that. That I understand my agency and engage my agency and realize my agency most in the act of engaging and supporting the agency of other people. And usually that's that's involved in engaging in deliberative behavior with them. That isn't necessarily just persuasion. It can just be bargaining. It just can be horse trading. There's many layers of it. But it always involves some kind of reciprocity. And I think democracy is preeminently a society where reciprocity is the key value. And it's chiefly reciprocity with the opponent. I think the thing that most distresses me about the society we live in today is the belief that we have to go for broke and get it all.
I agree.
And the whole world now is being plagued by people who think now's the time to go for broke and get it all. That's Putin, that's Trump, that's Netanyahu. They're all people who think now's the time to get it all while I can. And that's always a destructive aim, and that always winds up destroying the people who do it.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
For one thing, it cost them their soul. You asked in one of the other questions about the problem of an ethical obsession, a moral obsession, the destroying power of a moral obsession. I'm thinking the chief example of that would be religious fanaticism. One of the ways that I really damage the God I believe in is by killing people in his behalf. And one of the things that happens to me if I do that is that I discover I'm not really worshiping God. I'm worshiping myself with a much louder voice and a thunderbolt.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
This is an issue Lincoln raises in the second inaugural, that he says one of the great illusions that both sides had going into the Civil War is that each thought they were uniquely right, and each invoked God's aid to beat the other. And in doing that, each engaged in an act of almost blasphemous narcissism.
That's exactly what I was thinking. It's this kind of narcissism that is just so. It's almost. It's like this cloud that you can't see. Like you can't see past anything outside of it.
Yeah. Whatever God is, you don't have him in your back pocket.
Right.
Now, that's an argument made famously by the theologian Karl Barth during World War I.
Right.
Barth was offended by because he was a Swiss, he was particularly offended by German propaganda, which saw themselves acting as the arm of God. And his attitude is, if you think you're acting in the arm of God, you are an idolater. Because whatever God is, God's purposes are larger than your purposes, and you can never claim to speak for them. And if you do, he's going to make a fool of you. Lincoln asked that question when he asked himself, why did the Civil War go on so long? Which is one of the big themes he asked in the second inaugural address, but it's also in what's called the Meditation on God's Will, which we used to think was something he wrote in the summer of 1862 while he was waiting to deliver the Emancipation Proclamation. Now people think it's in 1864 when the Grant Spring Offensive is going badly. It doesn't matter. There's plenty of occasions to doubt this. Lincoln asked himself, both sides of the Civil War believe God is with them, that it can't be true that they both are. It seems a little fishy to say that I'm sure God's with me and not with them. It must be that God has a purpose that is neither quite ours.
Well, it's also when you do that, you're handing over agency and responsibility of yourself, and you're putting it into another or a higher, some deity of sorts.
Well, into your id,
right? Yeah, and
id wearing a halo.
Right, exactly. And it's saying, "Oh, I don't have to do anything anymore," or "I'm not responsible for what I'm doing anymore."
I don't have to worry whether I'm the good guy because
right.
I have a promissory note from God that He'll forgive me whatever I do because it's for Him.
And I think. Regardless of what your religious persuasions are, I don't think that in a shared reality with other humans, you get to abdicate human responsibility with other people.
And there's always something fishy about Crusader morality for exactly that reason. And that's why Lincoln is very suspicious of Crusader morality. I say in the book, it always kills what it loves.
Yeah, I agree. There's a similarity with that, but then there's also a uniqueness of that, right? Like there's, each country does that in different ways. So how countries in the Middle East use religion is different than how the United States or the United Kingdom or other places have used religion, or Latin America. Like it's interesting how there's a lot of crossover with this using a religious deity or an idea, but each based on history or other things, there's a sort of uniqueness to how that place does it within their own populace. I find that interesting as well.
I was thinking, I think this is from Rawls, but I'm not totally sure. I thought a little bit about what happened at the end of the wars of religion in the 17th century. Protestant and Catholic both had God in their back pocket, and the God they had in the back pocket was a killer and was really, I would say, more demonic than divine.
Yeah.
Because it was always, and what you discover if you're in the possession of that kind of idea is that idea always recruits all of the worst aspects of your personality in the services of the best and subverts the best aspects of your personality.
Yes, I agree.
That's why violence, which always seems to be the sign that now I'm really morally earnest, always winds up destroying the thing it's meaning to serve.
Fully
because
agree.
It makes my values demonic.
Fully agree.
I mean, what made Robespierre Robespierre? What made Lenin Lenin? Now, what keeps us from being demonized by our values? Well, the first thing is that kind of skepticism and self-awareness that Lincoln had in the second inaugural, where he says, I must be kidding myself if I think that I have God in my back pocket, even though I know that God must want the end of slavery. He isn't a skeptic about what right and wrong is, but he is a skeptic about whether he is serving God's will in every way. What he says is, it matters intensely that you do right, but it also matters intensely that you know that you do not have the good under your control and that it does not serve your narcissism. In fact, Lincoln winds up arguing that the reason the Civil War was so bloody and so inconclusive for so long is that both sides were complicit in slavery. And therefore, the idea that the free North is going to punish the slaveholding South was a narcissist illusion which the North had to pay for.
Yeah, I think that's right though, because I think when you have this this demonization of morals, I think, as you're saying, it eventually destroys yourself. And it has, I think, with others and other dynamics, far more. That's not to say that you should be amoral, but you shouldn't be obsessed with them. I think that they, directly or indirectly, they end up having way more deleterious effects than we anticipate. I think that you see this all the time.
Now, the way it happened at the end of the wars of religion is both sides realized that the wars had ended in a stalemate. That the situation was not going to arise where the Protestants were going to able to drive the Catholics off the face of the earth, and the situation was not going to arise where the Catholics were going to drive the Protestants off the face of the earth. So the first thing they had to do is come to a pure modus vivendi solution. And the solution they adopted at the end of the Treaty of Westphalia is, you fish on your side of the lake and I'll fish on my side of the lake and nobody will fish in the middle. That's a place name in Massachusetts. The longest place name in America, Lake Chargogagog Manchogagog Charbunagungumog. That means you fish on your side, I'll fish on my side, nobody fish in the middle. Anyway, but to get back to this, that's only a pragmatic solution that recognizes the stalemate, which is to say it's the best deal we can have, and we can't have the deal we really want, which is to drive the other guy to the wall. Now, that's only a modus vivendi solution, not a true solution, because where the lines are drawn is just a function of what the power equilibrium is at the moment those lines are drawn. And if the power equilibrium changes, those lines are going to change. So that's why that's not a permanent solution. The solution that was adopted in the Treaty of Westphalia, it's merely a recognition that we have to give up because nobody's going to win. The big change happens in the next generation. When they signed the Treaty of Westphalia, the view is, I would be a better Protestant if I could wipe all the Catholics out, but I can't do that, so I'm going to have to accept a second best solution and get along with them. And the other way around. A better solution, and this occurred in the next generation, is a tolerant Protestant is not just a second-rate Protestant, it's a first-rate Protestant. Because if I convert my enemy with the sword, that conversion is inauthentic.
Yeah, that's right.
And what I've done is corrupt the nature of my own faith by using that coercion. And once you say that toleration is not a second best solution that people adopt because they can't exterminate the other. Toleration is a first best solution because it expresses the freedom and agency that we expect out of a religious conviction. That's why religious toleration turned out in the United States to support rather than destroy religion. Because it took the element of coercion out of it. And that's the difference between a true compromise, which each side recognizes not only its pragmatic advantage, we accept it because I have to, but each side recognizes also that solution reflects its values. And that's a true solution. This is an argument Rawls makes in his book Political Liberalism. And I think that's what one looks for out of a democratic society is the ability of opposing sides to make a first best rather than a second best solution.
So yeah, but this is exactly where I wanted to kind of land a little bit. I wanted to say it all the way in the beginning of the conversation, but I actually like it here now much better. Is this idea of liberalism, right? And I think this is so important. So we can land here for a minute. Is okay. You can define liberalism how you want. That's fine. But I think the bigger important thing is liberalism. It gets thrown around, and a lot of people use it in different ways. And I think there's maybe not one true definition, but I think many people talk about in the United States now. They talk about, we're a divided country, and everybody's very it's what is it? Polarization, very polarized, all these things. And look, I mean, it certainly is, and social media and online culture doesn't really help, but there have been many times where this has been the case as well. And I guess the thing that you highlight which Lincoln and Douglas and their debates and the time of the 1850s and into the Civil War is this idea of this politics of consent in dealing fairly with each other and how it works in polarized ideological conflict. That liberalism, not conservatism necessarily, although I'm not going to beat up conservatism entirely, at least in the Burkean sense, but that liberalism shows citizens how you can have a moral investment in each other's ethical freedoms through moral deliberation with others' views to preserve against self-destruction. Chat about that.
Yeah, well, one of the ways you know that your moral motivations are not hysterical obsessions that will lead you to push the button is that you engage in worldly negotiation with people who are respectable enough and have different views.
Is that because it's a confidence thing? It's like it's a respect thing, but it's also a confidence thing, right? And an openness thing. So maybe it's three things of I have my view and I'm willing to be nominally confident in it, but also respectful for your views. Maybe you could change mine. Maybe you could adjust it. Is it those types of things that are coming into play?
Well, remember how persuasion happens. If I persuade you, and persuasion is just the best of many possible things, and there's sort of para-persuasive things that I also want to talk about. But persuasion, which is really the ideal state, is I find a common value and make a commanding appeal to it that changes your view of it. If I do that, what I argue is we agree on this, and my picture of you is a better interpretation of you as a thou than your picture of you. And which, if you buy it, you will be more you rather than less you. Remember, you'll always disagree with people in terms of agreements. That's the difference between argument and screaming. That in a moment when, you never have an argument without conceding that at some point in that argument, your opponent might score a point on you.
Right.
That your opponent might say something that you have to concede the correctness of. Because if your opponent can never say something persuasive to you, you're not arguing with them. You're just beating them up with words. The whole difference between beating people up with words and arguing with them is that I want to make an appeal to a commanding value the other will recognize and will fairly recognize from within his own values as a better interpretation of them than what he had thought. So that without making any fatal sacrifice of his values, he can change his mind. But in order to do that, I have to recognize that the opponent may be able to do that to me too. And if the opponent can do that to me, then I know that I am embracing my values in the right way, because I'm not just using them as a club to hit him over the head. So, I mean, that's why a persuasive economy is the thing that protects one from being abducted by one's own values and being demonized by one's own values. I think the word I want to use for this, and I think I got this word from Arendt, the word for that is worldliness.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. If I'm a worldly person, I realize that occasionally Mitt Romney is going to say something that he's totally right about and I'm totally wrong about. And Mitt Romney will occasionally say, oh, yeah, that's really so. So that there is a back and forth in true persuasive engagement. I think that's not always common. But I think outside of that, there are other forms of engaging the thou of the other. Deal making. I'll take half a loaf, you take half a loaf. Even balance of power. I'll end my strike if you give me health insurance.
Right.
A strike is a contest of force, but it's not an all-out contest of force. It's a rule-bound contest of force. So it's, I want to say, a para-persuasive contest of force, aimed not at coercing the opponent so much as in changing the way the opponent thinks about the conflict. I mean, that sounds awfully sanitized, but I think the point is it's different from a Hobbesian conflict of all against all.
What about this idea that I totally agree with everything you're saying. I like the way you're talking about the persuasion and the para-persuasion. But what about this idea, though, something that I've run into over the past, 7-8 years, is I'm having to persuade or engage or sometimes argue or most of the time hopefully dialogue with people that typically would be on quote unquote my side of things, right? This happens often too. It's not across, so to speak, the aisle. And here,
progressives are always beating me up too.
Yes, I've got my fair share. And then I get the insult where they say, "Are you just libertarian?" I said, "Okay, don't insult me." No, I'm just kidding. But
no, I'm a bourgeois liberal. That's what they call me, a bourgeois liberal.
But let me tell you. I mean, you'll probably identify with this. Then one of the things I've tried out with people, and sometimes it kind of works, is let's take an easy issue. Sort of easy. Let's say climate change, right? This is something that is fairly much people on the very much the left and very far left, have some pretty they can be very radical about this, right? We need to stop using airplanes and you can go as far as you want on this of trying because they care about the planet and all these things. Great.
Yeah, you get into a contest of increasing virtue that way. You get into a sort of potlatch of sacrifice.
Yes. It's what did Obama call it? This circular firing squad of sorts, right?
Yes, also true.
Right. Yeah, right. And one of the things I've told people on various issues about this is, so you take the climate change. I said, look, you care about this issue, climate change. We both agree that it's a problem. It's because of human involvement, et cetera, et cetera. You might care about climate change at an 11, right? If 10's the highest, you're at an 11, right? I also care about climate change, but I care about it at a 7. We both care, but we don't have to care the same exact way at the same level and the same intensity. Now,
and you don't have to call me names just because I'm a 7.
Right. And for me, I really care about gerrymandering. Like, that's a really important issue. I care about that at a 9. Maybe you care about that at a 4. We still care about it.
Racial equality is the big issue for me.
Right. Yeah, those things are really important, but both people can care about the same thing. It just doesn't need to be at the same level. It can be at different levels. You still care about it.
That's how negotiation happens.
Yeah, right.
That's the model of negotiation that Madison described in Federalist 10.
Yeah.
Before I get into that, I wanted to... there was a point I wanted to make, and now I've just forgotten what it was, but I think it'll come to me if I just start talking.
Yeah.
Why don't I talk about Madison, and the other point will come back.
Yeah, keep going.
Madison's argument in Federalist 10 is that people have many, many interests, and therefore they're engaged in many, many persuasive conflicts with each other. So that I feel strongly about issue A, not so strongly about issue B. I might be able to advance my cause in issue A by making a deal with somebody who, by saying, I'll give you a point on B as long as you give me A. I will give you your river and harbors bill if you give me my tariff. Now, purists think of that as corruption, right?
Yeah, right.
But in fact, that's one of the ways that people with different views manage to live with each other, is they use their engagement with each other along many axes to work out an equilibrium with each other. On one issue, I'll take half a loaf because I might get more of it later. On several issues, I'll trade you this issue I care somewhat about for another issue I care a great deal more about. Another thing that's going to bind me is, on this issue, you may be my opponent, but I better not spit in your face because I'm going to need you on some other issue where you're my ally.
That's right.
Also, on this issue, you may be my opponent, and I have the upper hand now, but I better not trample you because some thing may change and you may have the upper hand and you'll return the favor to me if I do.
That's right.
So there's all sorts of pragmatic reasons that constrain people in Madison's society, a heterogeneous society where people are dealing with each other over many, many interest issues. There's 1,000 reasons for people to engage in worldly relationships with each other. And those become themselves a thing of value. A political culture of deal-making becomes not just a pretext for me getting what I want, but also itself something that I feel expresses me, something where I feel I find myself, something where in dealing with you, I enter a world in which we both have a part. Arendt's word, this is Arendt's world of what power is where different people, by engaging each other in a persuasive economy, become something different and larger.
Yeah.
That's what she means by worldliness. Although I think the word actually comes from Kant. But
yeah. But tell me this though, just on this piece is, why is it seemingly so hard for people in a modern age, and I'm sure it was in the 1850s too, albeit different, but we can talk about popular sovereignty in a moment. But I guess, why is it hard for? I think people agree to it in theory or in the idea, but when you have it in practice, people have a hard time with liberal pluralism in the United States. Did you hear, John, what Florida's doing? Oh my God, I can't believe it. And he's like, oh my God, can you believe what California is doing? It's like, look, I might disagree, but I don't live in either one of those states, right? That if the polis, right, the people get together and they've elected people in their geographical region, and they've decided to do this crazy thing, or the other people do this crazy thing, that's their pluralistic right. That's why we have difference. That's the whole why we don't have a truly communist or one mind kind of way of ruling things. Why do people? You can criticize it or whatever. That's fine, but people get very exercised and animated about this. Why are we not okay with having a practical liberal society or a pluralistic society where people are going to do different things?
Until this administration, I was always glad that there was an opposition party. And the reason is that when my party gets the complete upper hand, think of situations where a party has complete control over a state. What happens under that situation is the people who are competing for leadership in that party want to outdo each other until finally they've ratcheted the party into untenable and practical positions. Until the party finally has, in order to gain the leadership of that party, you have to ask for something that's totally insane, because you can outbeat the other guy. The pressure of an opposition party is something that keeps your own party sane. Because there are aspects of our own views, there are aspects of our own views that are consequences that we are helpless not to face, and which we will face without political opposition. I guess the example is Republicans need Democrats so that they don't so deregulate the economy that it becomes unstable, the way capitalism became unstable in the 19th century. Democrats need Republicans so that they don't nanny our state into staleness. I think there are good reasons for having opposing parties, because it does give people binocular vision. And I think that sometimes the fact that the parties compete supersedes the fact that the parties also depend on each other.
That's right. That's right.
And I think the depressing thing right now, but I think this is more to be feared on the Republican side than on the Democratic side, is their belief that their opponents just aren't Americans.
Yeah.
I really dislike Trump and everything he stands for, but I am hoping that the Mitt Romneys of the Republican Party will eventually get the upper hand over him. And possibly that often happens in the wake of successive defeats. one of the reasons capitalism and democracy often run together is that the business cycle always comes to the rescue of the losing party.
That's right. That's usually how it works. but hard to see, what how things will kind of shake out here at the current moment.
I wanted to add a point about violence that I didn't get to earlier.
Yeah, please.
Now I've described it as the undoing of a persuasive culture, and it's full of all sorts of temptations. It's the temptation to take one's values in a demonic way, the temptation to kill what one loves, the temptation to turn a moral conviction into a moral obsession. And we've been talking about how engaging in a persuasive economy tames one's values so that they don't turn demonic, don't turn one in a completely destructive way. Mm-hmm. I want to say that there is a threat to a persuasive economy that it finds hard to manage. And that threat is, well, it's like the problem of prisoner's dilemma, mm-hmm. that a stable solution to prisoner's dilemma is tit for tat, and then we can keep going. Mm. I won't defect as long as you won't defect. Mm. But it's always to the advantage of somebody in prisoner's dilemma to defect if he thinks the other guy isn't going to. Mm. I think in a persuasive economy, somebody who has to make a deal may well be driven to the wall by somebody who doesn't. Mm. Mm. That ultimately is Lincoln's fear about Douglas. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because Lincoln and Douglas have slightly different ideas about what it is to make a deal. Lincoln says, to make a deal, I have to reach a consensus about an important value. Slavery is bad. And I'll make all sorts of concessions to you as long as you make that concession to me. Mm-hmm. The strength of that position is that that's truly a moral negotiation. The weakness of that position is that that kind of slaveholder does not have power in the South at that time. And if you are dealing with a Calhounist kind of slaveholder, or a positive good kind of slaveholder, you don't have the persuasive engagement with that kind of slaveholder because you don't have the values that would have traction with him. Mm. In fact, you have no idea what's going to have traction with him. Mm-hmm. If you believe that, what don't you believe? That's Lincoln's fear. Mm. Douglas has a slightly different position. His position is, I'm not going to look for a commanding value. I'm going to look for a temporary modus vivendi that we can live with for this moment. Mm. And Douglas's whole idea of politics is we skate very fast over the thin ice, and if we can go fast enough, we won't fall through it. Mm. Mm. Which means he's willing to give up an awful lot to hold off war for 2 weeks. And then in another 2 weeks, he's got to figure out the next arrangement to make. Now, I want to say that's not an immoral position.
Right.
And I think you only get to a true consensus negotiation after a whole hell of a lot of cobbled together modus vivendi solutions. Mm. The whole art of diplomacy, that President Biden was trying to practice in the Middle East was to cobble together enough in the way of temporary modus vivendi solutions to get people in the habit of dealing with each other. So that's not it is a limited aim, but sometimes it's the only possible aim. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And because Douglas was a Democrat and the Democratic Party was ruling the South and Democratic postmasters were telling him what it's really like down there, and Lincoln did not have that advantage, Douglas knew that the reasonable slaveholder that Lincoln was talking about did not exist anymore, could not be dealt with. So you had to make a deal that would keep the wolf from the door for now and figure out another deal later that would keep the wolf from the door. So, for instance, when he's dealing with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, of course he would prefer to keep the Missouri Compromise. He had only weeks before been trying to make territorial legislation for Kansas on the basis of the Missouri Compromise. He knew very well that the Missouri Compromise had not been superseded by the Compromise of 1850, but he also knew he could not get the other side to buy that deal. So what he thought is the deal he was going to say is, we'll let Kansas make the decision. And the logic of that is not just that, well, they should have the decision because it's their state and blah, blah, blah. The logic of the decision is, if I give the slave states every opportunity to control the outcome of Kansas and they still lose, they have to accept it. That's ultimately what Douglas's position was, because Douglas did not feel that slavery was going to go to Kansas.
So this is you're bringing in here basically as an example the differences that Lincoln and Douglas had on the notion of popular sovereignty.
Right, and also on what counts as an agreement.
Yeah, that too.
What counts as an agreement.
Right.
We don't have to have a convergence of values to have an agreement. All we have to do is have reason to not kill each other tomorrow.
But how did they come to? I mean, there's a lot of overlap in how they view things, but there's also difference. What was the kind of daylight between them on at least on the popular sovereignty issue?
All right. Well, there is less daylight between them than either of them lets on in the course of their debates. Because neither of them want slavery to go to Kansas, really. Douglas, because he represents the political interests of the free states, and the interests of the free states would not be served by a slave state in Kansas. Whatever he feels about slavery, he's a free state politician, and he stands for their interests. Douglas also feels it is important to have a government in Kansas, and any government is better than no government, which is what the alternative is. But he doesn't want a slavery government in Kansas. As it turns out, now the ill effect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, one that Lincoln totally predicted in the Peoria speech, is it set off a foot race for control of the state. And it set off 6 years of quasi-civil war. Actually, to the end of the Civil War, it set off 10 years of quasi-civil war in Kansas. And that clearly was not a good solution to the problem. But Douglas's idea was, if there's a trial of electoral strength in Kansas and we win it, the South has to agree to it because they accepted it. You could see that is a morally much weaker position than Lincoln's position, which is to say slavery shouldn't go to Kansas because it's wrong. And once it goes in there, we'll never get it out. And the people of Kansas will never be free of it once the yoke of slavery is put on them. By the summer of 1858, when they're debating, actually, whether the people of Kansas are going to support or oppose slavery has already been decided. After a series of fraudulent elections, the last territorial governor, Walker, persuades the Free Staters that maybe they want to take part in the Constitution writing process, and maybe they want to also run for the state legislature. Well, they don't agree to run for the Constitution making process because they don't trust Walker and they think the elections are fraudulent because they've all been. And so the Lecompton Convention meets and they write this lunatic convention, which not only makes it a slave state, but makes it a crime to criticize slavery. And makes it impossible to change the Constitution to end slavery. It's a really a lunatic document. But the most lunatic part of it all is they said, and we're going to send this straight to Washington, and we're not going to ask this Constitution to be ratified by the people of Kansas. All right. So this is too much.
Yeah.
And this is way too much for Douglas. But Buchanan says, oh, I guess that's okay, because that'll shore up his political position with the South. And he says, besides, the anti-slavery people had their chance when they were voting for delegates to the convention, and blah, blah, blah. You know how that goes. But it's really clear that by a very large majority, the people of Kansas do not want a slave state. Douglas tries to get his Democratic friends in the Senate to prevent the adoption of the Lecompton Constitution. But he has enough votes to hold it up. And then finally, another Democrat, a man named William English, proposes that they sort of have a vote about it. They can't actually reject it, but he proposes that they have a vote about another issue. And the issue is the Lecompton Constitution had Kansas seize a large piece of federal land in Kansas. And English says, well, maybe this is an issue. So either they could accept the Lecompton Constitution as it stands, slavery, land grant and all, or they can reject the land grant and then they've got to come back in 3 years only after their population triples. Well, you can see that that's a horrible bribe for the pro-slavery faction.
Yeah, this is completely terrible.
He gets just enough votes to get the English Compromise through. So the people of Kansas are given this lunatic vote where they're ostensibly voting about the land grant, but if they vote against their interests on the land grant, they'll get to turn down slavery later. So that seems like a horrible tilting of the election in favor of slavery. But the Lecompton Constitution loses 10-1 in that election. So as far as Douglas is concerned, that settles the issue. Slavery's not going to Kansas. But it's still a live issue because the pro-slavery vote in Senate will not allow Kansas to become a state under any circumstances if it is not a slave state. In other words, the slave power is going to insist, against the will of 9/10 of the population of Kansas, on forcing slavery into Kansas. So Lincoln and Douglas both oppose slavery going into Kansas, and what separates them is something quite subtle. Should slavery not go into Kansas because it's wrong, or should slavery not go into Kansas because the people of Kansas don't want it? That seems like a pretty subtle distinction to us. But that's the issue over which the whole Lincoln-Douglas debates are fought. For Lincoln, to make the decision just on the basis of what the people want argues that if the people want it, they can do anything. And, remember, in a liberal democracy, there's always a little tension between fair procedure and majority rule. Liberalism and democracy are always pulling against each other. In democracy, the white racists always get to rule. It's only liberalism that cures democracy of its racism. So that's what Lincoln and Douglas are fighting about. Lincoln's view of Douglas, I think the case, a lot of Lincoln's case against Douglas is nonsense. He pushes all these utterly lunatic, paranoid theories about what Douglas is doing, which I think are just crazy. And it amazes me that most historians take them seriously. That Douglas has been involved in a years-long conspiracy, not just to force slavery into Kansas and not just to force slavery into the other Western territories, but back into all the free states, Illinois included. I think that's lunatic stuff. And I think the fact that even somebody as level-headed as Lincoln believes that just proves how crazy the 1850s were.
Yes. It's a strange time for sure.
But the nub of Lincoln's argument against Douglas is, if you have to make a deal, that means the person who holds out the longest can always have his way. That under put Douglas under enough pressure and he'll fold. That's Lincoln's argument about Douglas in the long. That's his strongest argument against Douglas, the one that I think is ultimately persuasive. Incidentally, it turns out to be wrong. You know, at the end of Douglas's life, he does stand firm about the Lecompton Constitution, and he does stand firm for the Union. He spends the 1860 campaign season traveling around the South speaking out against secession, not campaigning for himself for the presidency. And on Inauguration Day, Lincoln goes up, you probably know the story of, he goes up to the podium with his hat on, and he realizes there's no place to put his hat. Douglas comes up and holds his hat. And while Lincoln is giving the first inaugural, Douglas is loudly praising it the whole time and making sure all the newsmen hear that Douglas is completely approving of what Lincoln says. And I should point out, this is kind of a sad moment. He goes to the inaugural ball and he dances with Mary Todd, whom, remember, he had proposed to. And Mary Todd Lincoln says to him, "Mr. Douglas, do you remember that you once promised that we would dance together in the White House?"
That's very funny. That's very funny, actually. The moment.
I think that's a very mean moment.
Yeah, it's a little. It's definitely mean. It's a bit of an irony there.
It's like the moment when Lincoln goes up to Mary Todd and says, "Mary Todd, I want to dance with you in the worst way." And they dance. And Mary Todd says to him after the dance, "Abraham Lincoln, you have had your wish. You have danced with me in the worst way." Douglas actually winds up dying because he exhausts himself raising troops for the Union Army. But the point is still that if you have to deal, you can be driven to the wall by the person who believes he doesn't have to deal. And the thing that's really startling about the pro-slavery position in the late 1850s is they're going to make a sticking point about Kansas where they are behind 10-1. They're going to make a sticking point about providing a national slave code for New Mexico territory where there are all of 20 slaves. They're going to make a national sticking point over reopening the African slave trade, something which actually in the actual Confederacy, once they had seceded, they outlawed opening the African slave trade. I mean, it essentially shows that there was no deal that was possible that would have held with the slave power, that the slave power would have been back for more and would have found some other occasion to hold the knife to the throat of the Union. Lincoln knew that, and Douglas did not.
Yeah, you mentioned these two differences about why they were opposed to this, and you mentioned in the book that Lincoln was worried that Douglas' doctrine of corrupting the public mind,
that it would publicly corrupt the mind,
right, that people could become indifferent to whether people were enslaved or not. How is this just not mere public opinion, but also this almost like Jungian collective unconscious body of habits, received opinions, prejudices, assumptions, allegiances, etc., in which we make a practical sense? Again, this is still a pragmatic argument of the political world. How did he see it this way?
Well, one thing is to remember that Lincoln was a Whig. And one thing that... This was my next question, but go on. Yeah.
Go on. Yeah.
One of the things that separates Whigs from Democrats is their understanding of what is required for a democracy to be stable. If you are a Whig, for a democracy to survive, it has to be surrounded by a whole culture of democracy and a long tradition of people dealing with each other together under democratic conditions. That democracy is the fruit of a history that goes back to Magna Carta and back to the Glorious Revolution. It's not so natural to human beings that they can just wake up and be Democrats. The democratic position is that because democracy is the natural birthright of all people as people, the cultural requirements for democracy to exist are thin, and almost anybody can be a Democrat, a small d Democrat, as long as they pay attention to what it is to be a voter. Now, the consequence of this was that the Whigs tended to be nativists, because their view is, if you come from a society that has known nothing but tyrannous kings, you don't know what it is to be a democratic citizen. You have to be acculturated to democracy, and democracy requires the support of habits that are so deeply ingrained that you're not even aware of having them. That democracy is the fruit of a whole way of life that arises out of a history of democratic practices. So that's why they're nativists. That's also why they're anti-Catholics, because their attitude is Catholics are ruled by the tyrannous Pope, and they're going to do what he orders. So they can't possibly be citizens of the democracy, because they have allegiance to the whore of Babylon.
So, but why did the Whig Party dissolve and eventually crumble?
Well, let me get to that, because I want to talk about. That's why the Democratic Party was not nativist. Because if you believe that democracy is the natural birthright of all people as people, you're a good enough Democrat after 30 days. And in point of fact, in Illinois before the Civil War, if you were a non-U.S. citizen, you could still vote in state elections if you'd been there for 30 days. Now, so that accounts for one of the weird facts of 19th century politics, which is that nativism and racism were competing ideologies, not congruent ideologies. You know, for us, nativism and racism are versions of the same thing, right? If you hate immigrants, you also hate black people. And to hate immigrants and to hate black people are both the same thing. It's both a kind of projected hatred of the id, you know. 19th century politics, if you were an anti-nativist, you tended to be a vicious racist. And I think partly that's because of Herrenvolk democracy. The poor white could only be equal if whiteness was the key. And that whiteness became the thing that made it possible for him to be a citizen and made the black person not possible to be a citizen, the black person with whom he was in economic competition. So the Whig Party always believed that citizenship is a culture and a habit that you have to be initiated into over a whole life. It's of a piece with the Whigs' attachment to things like temperance, a belief that through discipline and habit you could fake it till you make it. And they think of democracy as a matter of faking it till you make it over many generations. In fact, their view of life, this is famously described by Daniel Walker Howe in a book called The Political Culture of the American Whigs, that they tended to be a more feminist party than the Democrats, partly because temperance begat feminism. They tended to be a less racist party because they were hierarchs, but because they were hierarchs, they didn't have to argue that the people they wanted to be unequal to had to be non-human. You know, they could be the people we have to be patrons for. You know, if you're comfortable with inequality, then racial inequality is just one more, and it doesn't have to be inflamed. If the only inequality you're going to have is racial inequality, you're going to be a race hatred racist. So the Democratic Party was egalitarian and racist. The Whig Party was inegalitarian, racist, but racist in a different way. The Whig Party tended to be opposed to maltreatment of the Indians, and the Democratic Party was very for it. The Whig Party was full of those anti-slavery slaveholders. The Democratic Party was dominated by slavery as a positive good slaveholders. One of the ironies is that the nativists the Know Nothing Party, which was the nativist party in the early 1850s, was an anti-slavery party. And the Know Nothing Party was a feminist party. It was the Know Nothing Party that first desegregated the Boston public schools in the 1850s. It was the Know Nothing Party that first gave women the right to own property separate from their husbands in Massachusetts in the 1850s. They were not a party of troglodyte cavemen.
Right.
But they were a party that was a nativist party. Interestingly, in the South, the Know Nothing Party wasn't even a nativist party. They were the Unionist Party. Because the secessionists dominated the Democrats, everybody who wished to save the Union became a know-nothing. Even in Illinois in the 1856 election, the people who voted for Fillmore, who was the American Party's nominee, were mostly not nativists. Fillmore himself wasn't really a nativist. What he was a desperate unionist who wished to appeal to Southern moderates, who could believe if we could make nice and just stop talking about slavery, maybe the issue would go away. And Douglas's hope in 1858 was to win the Fillmore voters to him. And he did. That's why he won the election. And he won the election by saying the House divided speech is inflammatory, and if you follow the logic of the House divided speech, you'll have war. And that scared the death out of the Fillmore voters, and they voted for Douglas. So the great irony is that in the 1858 campaign, Lincoln appears to be like Jackson, taking a hard position against Southern secessionists and beating them into submission. In other words, like the original leader of the Democratic Party.
Right.
And Douglas seems to step into the mantle of Clay, being the compromiser and the cobbler together of deals. And indeed, Clay's successor in the Senate, John Crittenden, writes a letter endorsing Douglas, and that makes a lot of difference to Douglas's outcome of the 1858 Senate election. But actually, I was getting into this subject because I wanted to talk a little bit about violence.
Yeah.
If you are absolutely unwilling to resort to violence, and the other side knows that, they can force you to the wall. Because you have to deal and they don't. Right? That's what Hitler did to Chamberlain.
Yep.
Now, and you know that's what Harry Jaffa thinks the South was going to do to Douglas, because Jaffa always describes Douglas as essentially a weird combination of Harry Jaffa and Thrasymachus.
But it's not true. It's not true though. Of course
it's not true.
Right. Yeah.
Of course it's not true. And in Jaffa's first book, he actually portrays Douglas as a anti-slavery politician and not a lunatic. And when my book came out, I learned before Jaffa died that he was writing a refutation of my book. But he died before he wrote it. But he did, out of the blue, call me up in the office one day. And I'd never met him. I didn't know him from Adam. But I picked up the phone, and it's Harry Jaffa. And he tells me who he is. And he says, I understand from your book that you treat Douglas with a certain amount of sympathy. Which is true. He's not the hero of my book, but he's not the villain either. Calhoun's the villain. Where did you get that idea? He says. And I said, well, Professor Jaffa, I got it from you.
Where did I say this? Where did you read that?
He knew where I got it. I got it from the Crisis of the House Divided. He had just changed his mind over the years.
That's very funny.
But at any rate, the point is that if you want to stand for deal making, if you want to stand for compromise, if you want to stand for liberalism, the other side can often feel they can win a contest of force with you. And if you read fiction about the Cold War, we woolly liberals always don't come off so well next to the earnest communists who have history on their side. Think of how Smiley looks in the Le Carre novels next to Carla. Carla knows what he wants, and Smiley is always sweating and uncertain and doesn't know what he wants. But I have an anecdote about that I'm going to tell in a minute. I think the key, and this is something Lincoln understands, and that possibly other people of a we must preserve persuasive comedy thing don't stand, is that around true persuasive engagement is an outer circle of para-persuasion, where I'm just making a practical deal that'll last a minute rather than an actual compromise. Outside of that is a rule-bound conflict of force, like a strike. And then outside of that comes war. And outside of that comes the darkest of all kinds of war, which we might say is religious war or people's war, where you just don't like the other guy's face and you're going to kill him. And you're going to feel you're purifying the world by doing that. Ironically, that's the kind of war an idealist will fight. But that's also the very least kind of war an idealist can survive. And it's also the war that's most destructive of idealism. Lincoln understands that there is a point at which push will come to shove. And Lincoln's effort throughout the Civil War is to remember that despite the fact that even though push has come to shove, I have to remember that I have to live with these guys later. And I think that's the whole key to Lincoln as a politician, is the recognition that even people I have fought a bloody struggle with are people I'm going to have to live with later. And I should remember not to think of them as people I shouldn't have to live with.
Is this where you bring up in the book this idea of reasonableness, right, for political authority, right? I wanted to ask about this because it struck me when I read it, and how do we have reasonableness with explicit principles, that one's core value, but we can separate personal and public beliefs, like we talked about earlier. How do you see this notion of reasonableness?
Well, I got it from Rawls. That's an idea he develops in his book, Political Liberalism. I may understand it slightly differently from how he does. Rawls describes, he distinguishes between rationality and reasonableness. Rationality is calculation about propositions from first principles. Rationality is making a logically solid argument for your proposition. The issue with rationality is that often it is self-enclosed in its own mindset, right? Sometimes you must have argued with people where you think, I just don't have a purchase for them because their rationality is self-sealed in itself. Like arguing with certain kinds of communists, because they can always write off with what you say as, oh, that's a bourgeois sensibility.
That's right, yeah.
Right. There is a way in which rationality lends itself to a certain kind of hard-headedness. And oddly, a certain way of closing one's mind to the other side, because I know I'm totally rational. The totally rational character is frequently in fiction a totally destructive character, right? I think of in Spencer's The Fairy Queen, he has one of the world's first robots, who is a character named Talus. And Talus is somebody who understands all of his moral principles completely literally, and therefore he's always killing people.
Yeah, it's sort of the Spock, right? It's this
yeah,
right.
except Spock himself actually has strong human feelings.
Right.
Spock believes he is totally rational, but he's not.
Sure, yeah.
The guy who's totally rational is the science officer in Alien.
Ah, yes. Right? That's right, yeah.
And you'll notice how often the totally rational character is also, in an unacknowledged way, a complete sadist.
This is a small tangential thing, but this is why I really resist certain folks that really overemphasize this kind of scientism that we see sometimes, where it's just pure cognitive reasoning. It's like, look, I love rationality and all of that, but you have to also broaden all of these other components. And it's at the very least, the charitable view is that it's very minimized. And I think that's a harm in that.
Pure rationality gave us social Darwinism, than which no ideology has ever been more destructive. But
the reasonableness. Sorry,
pure rationality gives us social Darwinism. Reasonableness is a way of compromising rationality, and essentially, the first thing to notice about reasonableness is exactly how one's ideas or principles work out is not always completely clear from within the principles. Aristotle argues, for instance, that when you have a rule, you don't really know how the rule applies until you've lived with it for a while. And he has this word phronesis, which is an intuitive knowing about how to apply rules, and you cannot reduce that intuitive knowing about how to apply rules to rules. I can think of this as applying in far more areas than just in ethics. Think of the difference between knowing a lot of chemistry and thinking like a chemist. If you're thinking like a chemist, you don't have only the rational, factual knowledge of chemistry. You have the intuitive habit of knowing the hang of chemical ideas and knowing what is the next question which is going to rise, knowing what is the hole in our structure of thinking for this point. There is an artistic side to being a scientist that isn't purely rational, that involves an essentially aesthetic insight into the flow of one's thinking. I even think that applies to mathematics. A mathematical idea is secure when they have the theorem. But when you're the graduate student writing your dissertation, you don't have the theorem yet. What you have is an intuitive understanding from your years of experience of a mathematician of some place where there may be a theorem that you smell but haven't yet found.
It's like having a almost you've sort of metabolized all of these things. You've metabolized the rationality, and you've distilled it enough, and then you can kind of put it back out in something that's more pragmatic and alive in some ways.
Yeah. You have an adult understanding of your reasons. That's the difference between the sophomore philosophy major and the actual philosopher.
You read The Fountainhead. And you realize, this isn't good philosophy actually, and it's barely good fiction. So
right. The example of somebody who is tyrannized by rationality, I think, frequently is a reader of Ayn Rand.
Yes, I would agree. Yes.
But let's assume that isn't the story of all readers of Ayn Rand.
Sure. Yeah.
But I want to get to what rationality is. Rawls has a rough and ready sense of what it means. He says, imagine you're negotiating with somebody. And imagine a situation under which you say, your position is rational, but it's completely unreasonable. Now, we know what that means. That means your position makes sense from within your worldview and from within your premises and from within your interests. But surely you understand that we have to strike a deal that we both have to accept. And that what reasonableness is openness to the intellectual world of the other, and is enough distance on one's own premises that one can escape being tyrannized by them. That's why we want to be worldly people.
Yes.
And that's why we want to engage with people across lines of difference so that we understand the difference between reasonableness and rationality, because ultimately reasonableness is going to matter a lot more than rationality.
So in Lincoln's idea of this is showing us how an understanding of those concepts, or the Rawlsian concept, is understanding how we're able to have true political authority, and we can have a good pragmatism. How does it map on to what Lincoln was up to?
Well, unfortunately, as I think I said, Lincoln had a mistaken and slightly idealized vision of whom he would be able to address, and did not fully understand that the lesser of two evils slaveholder had been driven from the field by the positive good slaveholder. But I can give him credit because of his understanding of reasonableness that he never completely lost faith with making some kind of intellectual contact with the other side. Though it's true, in the Cooper Union speech, he kind of despairs of it. He says that the reason I can't persuade the slaveholder is because he hasn't opened himself to persuasion, that he's imprisoned himself in his own ideas. But I think there is still some hope that I could say, for Christ's sake, wake up. And I think that's what the hope of the first inaugural is for Christ's sake, wake up. But it didn't work out. I mean, I think the first inaugural is a pretty pacific speech. I also think he almost gives the store away in the first inaugural. You know, he's willing to give the slave states a constitutional amendment making slavery perpetual if they'll stay in the Union, and they won't. I think he's even willing to concede a federal slave code. And they're still not going to buy it, although that's the issue over which they broke up the Union. And when the speech is given, the South denounces it as fanaticism and declaration of war, so much so that Lincoln wondered whether they'd even read the speech before they composed the replies. I think the tension between rationality and reasonableness still is really key to what a persuasive exchange is. And I think another key is that both sides have to be afraid of the consequences if persuasive engagement fails. You know, the great argument for us continuing to negotiate with the Russians is that we both have nuclear weapons. And, you know, we often make an argument about what is it that is within the pale of negotiating about and what is totally irrational and immoral to negotiate about. I don't think I can make a rule about that, because if I've got the bomb and the guy I'm negotiating with has the bomb, I have to deal with him where he is.
Yeah, especially because those are high stakes, and we understand we can't operate from where we would like them to be. We have to operate with where they're at.
And you know, I still think it is rather surprising that in all those years, the U.S. and the Soviet Union did not kill each other.
Yeah, I would agree, actually. Reading the history on it now, it is very surprising.
Some of it, you know, there's some near things. There was that officer on the Soviet submarine who was ordered to fire the nuclear weapons and said, nah, this has to be a mistake.
Yeah.
I guess we're all alive for that reason. I also want to point out that sometimes the guy who needs to engage in conversation is a little stronger than you think. Remember, the Japanese Empire and the Nazi Empire thought the democracies would be pushovers, and they weren't. I remember I talked a few minutes ago about how Smiley always looks a little irresolute next to Carla. There's an incident in the miniseries where Smiley actually captures Carla, and Stalin has just died, and there's upheaval in the Soviet Union, and people are being called back to Moscow and executed, depending on who they have backed in the power struggle that's going on in the Kremlin. And Smiley hears that Carla has been summoned back to Moscow, which he knows and Carla knows means they're probably going to shoot him. So Smiley gets Carla, and he says, look, I know you have a powerful belief that organizes your life and organizes your world, and you have firm convictions, and I'm a sloppy establishment liberal who has no convictions and only wants to get along and manage. And I know that those are ideas you have contempt for, but look, they're going to kill you, and we're not. And they have betrayed every conviction you've had, And do you really want to give your life to them for those convictions? And while he's making this case, Carla is not saying a word. Carla doesn't respond at all. And after Smiley is finally reduced to incoherence by making his pitch, Carla stands up and holds out his hands as if to say, "Put the handcuffs back on me and send me to Moscow." And Smiley is humiliated by this. In fact, Carla steals Smiley's lighter and gets from it the idea of having his mole seduce Smiley's wife so that Smiley can't denounce the mole because nobody will believe him. At any rate, Smiley tells this story to Peter Gwilym, his protege. And Gwilym says, how can we hold our own against that? How can we possibly win? They have firm beliefs. They have strong convictions, and all we have is shilly-shallying liberalism. And Smiley says, oh no, this is how I know we are going to defeat them. Because it means that Carla is a fanatic, and there is no fanatic who is not shouting down an inner doubt. And I think that is ultimately true of the pro-slavery fanatics. Because one of the things that was always going on between them is that they were engaged in a loyalty politics competition to see who could out-extreme the other and be the leadership of the movement. And the slightest bit of reasonableness was seen as a sign of treason. You know, you are a rhino, as it were. And I think that's a sign that the conviction is brittle and under pressure might collapse. So maybe it's good to be a mushy liberal.
Sometimes I certainly agree. I think that sometimes you can see moments of this where maybe that is the case. I just want to say here, there's a few things before I kind of get some more of the big picture things here. It would be remiss to not bring this up, but you can just kind of loosely. You don't have to go into full details unless you want to, but we've talked about it at different points in the conversation of this idea of Lincoln's public-private view, but even publicly his evolution on slavery. Right? He always thought it was wrong, but you know, you talked about it in the beginning about, you know, he had the Emancipation Proclamation in the drawer, waiting for the final moment, all these things, but it's a legal document and it functions that way. It almost has to be, and that having former slaves fight alongside freed people, you can't go back from that. And
exactly,
and that, you know, he had the whole colonization idea, but finally, I guess that the evolution of it publicly is really interesting to me. I think he always believed it was wrong. I mean, you have...
Yes, I think so, but he maybe had different beliefs about what he could do about it.
Exactly, right. I mean, this guy, you know, I mean, maybe it's a bit apocryphal, but, you know, he had this belief that, you know, when he was a kid, the first time he went out hunting with his dad or whomever it was, and he shot a rabbit or an animal, and he said, I can never do that again. I can never, you know.
Oh, yeah, I think that's a true story.
Right. And it's just like, this guy from day one, essentially when he was a kid, really did not like mistreatment of life. And okay, ironic to say during the Civil War, but I guess on the slavery issue, though, is how did he have this public evolution on the slavery thing to where we get to emancipation and then eventually 14th Amendment?
Well, yes, actually, it goes through many steps. And at each step, every time he takes a step, he tries to deny that he has the next step in mind. He always wants to take a step while issuing plausible deniability about where he's going, and then he lays the groundwork for where he's going. So, for instance, until September 1862, he says, I can't act against slavery because it will endanger the Union. Then in September 1862, he says, I can act against slavery because saving the Union requires it. Now, remember, saving the Union and acting against slavery turn out to be closely connected goals anyway. If you give up the Union, you can't end slavery. If you save the Union by tolerating slavery forever, you endanger it again. So the two goals are closely related, and you can't have one without the other, and you have to have them in that order, the order he does it. But what so in 1862, he says, I can end slavery to save the Union. By the time he gets to the Gettysburg Address, his view is very different. He says, this is a war about equality, not a war about union. And we have this war because a union dedicated to equality is going to be committed to fighting a war because there are certain tests about being an equal society that you can't evade any more than you can evade childhood diseases if you're a baby. That this is going to be the existential test of whether democracy can survive and be stable, particularly whether equal democracy can survive and be stable. So there's a reversal of view at the time of the Gettysburg Address, which many of his critics seized on. They said, hey, we're not fighting a war about equality. We're fighting a war about union. We didn't sign up for a war about equality. But Lincoln makes it clear to him in the Gettysburg Address that equality is what the war means. But he doesn't totally say what equality means. Does equality mean I give you your human rights, your rights, not your rights to life and liberty and to pursuit of happiness, which I think means your right to seek to thrive? That's a rather minimal right. Because that doesn't include political equality, a right to the say. It doesn't include, let's say, social equality, which is to say, I have a right to practice a profession. I have a right to I have a right to my pay. I have a right to live where I wish. That kind of thing. And it also doesn't mean political equality. I have a right to have a say in the Republic. I have a right to serve on a jury, which is one of the places the Republic makes its will known, and I have a right to vote, which is the other place the Republic makes its will known. Lincoln did not feel, in the Gettysburg Address, he didn't say what equality meant. And in the opening of 1865, he offers nothing but freedom, nothing but not being a slave. That's all the 13th Amendment offers. And if you'll remember, because this is a famous moment in the movie Lincoln, in order to get that, Lincoln has to promise, no, I am not imagining social equality between white and black at all. And he gets Thaddeus Stevens to have to say the same thing. One imagines he said that and went home and barfed. But that's the price of ending slavery. And it's also the precondition of having social equality is that you promise not to give it.
Can I make a strange comparison here? And you can tell me if I'm totally wrong. But you have Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson for 12 years consecutively voting against civil rights bills. And then in 1957, 100 years later, he votes for a key civil rights bill, which then is the springboard, or I should say the groundwork for then, after he gets, in after Kennedy's shot, to do in 64 and 65, the Civil Rights Act, and then the Fair Housing Act, and then the Voting Rights Act. Is this sort of the same thing? Like, I'm going to play a long game, and I'm going to do all of this because I'm a Southern Democrat still, and I'm going to vote against, and then boom, 360, and then we're here because that's where I'm waiting for the climate to be there. Is this sort of similar, or is this totally different?
It's exactly similar. Yeah. That's what Caro's book is.
Yes, that's fantastic.
That's what that's the whole genius of Caro's book. Yeah. Is what is the background of this idea? And it's clear that he sees. His Johnson is a far more mixed figure than Lincoln because he's a very ugly human being and a very flawed human being.
Oh yes.
And he's a human being whom it is a surprise that there is this deep inner decency in and commitment to compassion. And Caro is, Caro is very hard on Johnson in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But he points out that compassion was there early when he was teaching those Mexican-American children in the Rio Grande Valley.
That's right.
I think Johnson really is, next to Lincoln, a truly heroic figure.
I agree.
And a more tragic figure. Because it all blew up.
Yeah.
And partly it blew up because of him. Because he didn't know how to keep out of the Vietnam War. But he also emerged out of the most racist parts of the American political order.
Oh, yeah. The hill country in Texas, was.
Yeah, and not just the South, but the populist South. It's like in Huckleberry Finn, right? It's easy for Tom Sawyer. It's harder to imagine Huckleberry Finn, the son of Pap Finn, reaching some kind of gentlemanly understanding with Jim. Actually, it turns out it matters a great deal more from Huck than it does from Tom, because Tom is a faker. But the point is, there were decent, upstanding Atticus Finch types in the South, and Johnson was not one of them. It had to be somebody like Johnson to do it, and only Johnson could have done it. And Johnson had to bait race with the best of them. He had to kowtow to Richard Russell like everybody else. There is a story, possibly anecdotal, of Roger Wilkins who was the son of the head of the Congress of Racial Equality, and the writer, the guy who wrote Jefferson's Pillow. He was an aide to Johnson, and there's a story of Wilkins going up to Johnson and saying, "I don't understand this, Linton. You had to kowtow to Richard Russell. You had to bait race like everybody else. How is it that you're the guy who gets across the Voting Rights Act?" And Johnson says, "Son, now that I'm president, I'm free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last."
That so sounds like something Johnson would say.
I understand that the story is apocryphal, but it has to be true.
It has to be true. It has to.
It has to be true.
It has to be.
And the real power of it, too, is that Johnson is a great partisan operator.
Oh, yeah.
And he used all of his partisan skill to make this happen, the way Lincoln did in the movie, right? And Johnson knew this, the upshot of what Johnson did would be the destruction of the prospects of the Democratic Party for a half century. And the fact that a man whom we know of mostly as an amoral partisan operator is the guy who can do that, that's the sign of his real inner greatness.
I firmly agree. I didn't, he was obviously around before I was born, but I kind of fell in love with Johnson's legitimate political genius. I think for Democrats, he's probably the last. I put him. If you asterisk or put on the shelf Vietnam, which obviously is a stain for him, but I put LBJ up there with FDR.
I do too.
1,000%.
I do too.
His
in some ways, he's even greater.
I agree. I fully agree.
FDR understood something that understood a rule about American politics that Johnson tried to break. The rule about American politics, I think this is a very ugly rule, and I hope it's wrong. But there's two great issues: social insurance and racial equality. And FDR gave us social insurance.
Yeah.
But he did not challenge Jim Crow.
That's right, yeah.
Well, actually, let me correct that. He challenged Jim Crow around the margins.
I was going to say, it's a tepid kind of challenge of sorts, yeah.
And he made sure that many of the benefits he offered got to black people.
Sure.
Not quite Social Security, but many of the others.
Sure, yeah.
And they understood that. many black voters loved Roosevelt, and they weren't wrong to do it. But Roosevelt was far less committed to racial equality than his wife was, and far less committed to racial equality than he was to social insurance. Because Johnson knew that the moment he challenged Jim Crow, all of his social legislation ran out the window. On the other side, to give Johnson some credit, he also knew that racial equality would not have a chance in the South so long as the South was desperately poor. So in providing the New Deal to the South and the TVA to the South, he did lay the groundwork for civil rights, but he could do that only if he totally ignored that that's what he was doing. And is that FDR's genius, or is it just the cunning of history, not the cunning of FDR? I don't know. But I know that it probably couldn't have happened in any other way.
Yeah, I would agree.
Johnson is the one person in American history I can think of who tried simultaneously to deal with economic inequality and racial inequality. The Great Society was a program for white and black alike. And civil rights was about racial equality. Now, that's what made him great, but there's a risk in that because the business-oriented party will always say, if you combine social insurance with racial equality, you're paying black people to loaf. And the attack that was put on the Great Society, chiefly by Reagan, and the thing I'll never quite forgive Reagan for is he treated all social insurance, as if it only went to black people, and as if it was always involved welfare cheating.
And that's a meme that still resonates today. People still have this corrupted way of thinking about all of these things. When prior to Reagan, and in a political sense, it's great propaganda, right? I mean, obviously because it's effective, unfortunately. But up until that point, all of these things were couched within a class kind of way of dealing with things.
Right. And, I give credit to Biden for trying to do that, for trying to get out of that bind of tying together class politics and race politics. He didn't succeed at it,
no,
but his instincts were correct. And I noticed that those instincts paralyzed both Clinton and Obama.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think maybe I'll give Obama a little bit of leeway because, you're the first black president. There's not going to be a whole lot you're going to do on racial issues. But he did, I think, kind of see politically the tea leaves of, I'm going to make a deal on the social issue of healthcare.
Right. And he got through the greatest social achievement since Johnson. Obamacare was a tremendous achievement. And he was able to get it through by not pushing the other areas of his agenda. And that's why that's why people have slightly mixed feelings about Obama now. I don't. I think he did what he was capable of doing, what he could do.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and you see that. I mean, again, poor Obama in some ways. I mean, it would be interesting to see if he didn't have this, but I mean, he really only had 2 years because since 2010, it was just stalemated because of the Tea Party and everything else. So it's like, the fact that he did do a lot of things and use the moment and use the crisis well, I think again is tremendous.
Yeah, his ability to act was ended in late 2009 when Scott Brown was elected to the Senate.
That's right.
Because then he lost the ability to override a filibuster.
And a lot of the, I think it was around end of 2009, Christmas time, where Obamacare was kind of dead, and then Pelosi resurrected it in early 2010 and really got it across in March too. A lot of her help as well.
Exactly. Not the bill that Obama wanted because the House bill was weaker. Or which of the bill was weaker?
Or maybe the Senate because it had the Cornhusker kickback and all that stuff. Right.
Right. the bill that emerged was weaker than the bill they had to give up because they had lost the ability to have another vote in the Senate.
Yeah, it was a lot of the Blue Dog Democrats. It was Ben Nelson in Nebraska, and I think one of the guys in North Carolina kind of were, kind of sinking it a little bit. But they finally got it through. And it's a big. I think it. Obviously it's huge. And so, I guess a few questions here to end. There's 2 or 3 questions here to end. Here is one question that's really interesting for me is, when you look at Lincoln's life, right, his life and his politics, and you look at the major themes there, how is it a lot of the times connected with this absolute cultural precondition of political freedom as the big moral quality for all people? How is that a big essence of how he sees it?
I mean, that's absolutely the key value of Lincoln. It's in the Gettysburg Address. I think it's because equality is the precondition of recognizing the other as a thou. Equality is the precondition of recognizing the other as an agent. Equality is the precondition of entering into a deliberative economy. Yeah. In every society, the deliberative circle that makes all the decisions has equality. The question is how large is that circle? Yeah. Right? Yeah. In the classical world, there was equality in the polis, but the polis was only a small percentage of the population of Athens, and the polis depended upon the subjection of the oikos. What's new in America, and America's great gift to the world, is offering equality while erasing the division between the polis and the oikos. And that's what Lincoln means about equality in the Gettysburg Address, is the idea that equality is something that can be reasonably offered to all persons. And that's really the peculiar thing about the United States, that it argues that its peculiar national tradition is something that it proclaims is superior to all national traditions and is the sort of end and destiny of all human beings, to recognize natural equality.
I guess the one thing there that's interesting is with this. I mean, it is a sort of unique thing. But how did Lincoln believe that America was this idea and not blood and history alone? That ideas of freedom, equality, moral values are important for America. But he placed a high value on America as an idea and mutual forgiveness. I believe in that too, but I have also, I don't know. I sometimes that idea of America as an idea, I have mixed feelings about it. I mean, there's a big part of me
that it's an idea more honored in the breach than in the observance.
Yeah, that's one thing. I feel mixed, but yeah, tell us what he thought about it and maybe your thoughts.
Well, I mean, really, one of the distinctive features about America is that it does attempt to define a sense of what is American about Americans in a way that does not depend on the usual definitions of nationality. Usually a nationality is on the basis of shared language, shared religion, shared culture and art, shared history.
But we do have those things, though, now. We've created those things.
Now, but we still think of the paradigmatic, we still are a little bit nervous about the idea of America as being a blood nationality in the way that France is. Still, our sense of what it is to be an American, what's unique about it is that if you are an American by choice rather than by birth, you are every bit as American as an American whose ancestors came here on the Mayflower. That he said that he gives a famous speech where he says that America is not a creature of blood. It's a creature of an idea, and that idea is the idea of equality and freedom. Now, interestingly, that's a belief that's in some tension with his identity as a Whig.
That whole nativist thing coming out again.
Right. But remember, even the Whigs think you can be initiated into Americanness in the long run. It's not like Japan, where you cannot be a naturalized citizen at all. And even in Germany and France, you can be a French citizen, but you're never fully French. Whereas America promises that if you choose to be an American, and if you adhere to democracy as opposed to culture, being a small d Democrat makes you as an American as anybody else. And that's an idea that Lincoln articulated in a famous 4th of July speech, that that American nationality is carried by an idea, not by a history. Now, Americans do have a history, but Americans see themselves as not bound by that history because they think of Americanness as equally powerful when it's chosen as when it's given. I notice with alarm, and incidentally, it's unusual for a culture to decide that. Germany has admitted lots of immigrants, but it does not quite think of them as German.
Yes.
So I give a lot of credit to Mutti for opening Germany to them and for arguing that Germany must be a host to them. But German culture will never quite make them totally German. There's a tremendous difference that's happened in Britain in the last 30 years, particularly under Blair, that Blair wants to argue that Britain is a multicultural society in the way that the United States has. It is not clear to me that Britain has accepted that fact.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I think the Reform Party wants to say no to that. I think Canada sees itself almost as a multicultural society in the way that the United States does. The only place where blood and soil matters in Canada is in Quebec, and much less than it used to. I notice with alarm that Vice President Vance is it Vice President Vance? Some important Republican figure is giving speeches saying it is not true that America is an idea. America is a society. America is a culture. America is a blood. America is a history. And I view that as really profoundly un-American.
But I guess I don't disagree with the America as an idea thing. I guess here's my sticking point here on this is I love my country so much, right? But I do push and resist on this. Look, every country is going to have some sense of pride in their history or their might or their achievements, and that's fine. Everyone can do that. I think there's a healthy element of that. But I think this thing of America as an idea sometimes gets pushed out as we're the best, we're the better than every other country, we're the most unique, and then it starts to become this other sort of like.
Then it becomes the club we beat everybody else over the head.
That's right. And I hear
how to manage things.
And they say, "Oh, well, of course we're the best. We're the best. We do it the best." And it's just I'm allergic to that.
I agree with that, but I still believe that. I still think the distinctive feature of America is that it's an idea, but I also think that it's an institution and it's a human institution with all the flaws of human institutions.
But how do we have that balance though of appreciating the aspects that it is an idea, but we don't have this that we can have a really salubrious kind of way of understanding the idea, but not this narcissistic, where we're waffling into this kind of thing of like we're superior kind of thing, because that's where I feel it goes to.
Well, Xavier, I think at the moment we're having a profoundly humbling experience.
That's an understatement.
And maybe understanding the meaning of that humbling experience will make us a little less cocky.
I mean, that's sort of where I've been at, and I don't want people to ever misinterpret that. I love my country so much. I can critique it, but I do regardless love it, no matter who's in the White House, who's in the Congress, who's on the Supreme Court. But it is a humbling thing. It is a humbling thing.
I love America enough to tear out my hair about it all the time.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly how I feel about it too. So,
and I certainly hope we make it through this time of trial.
Yeah. I totally agree, and I guess I'm going to combine my last question or last two questions into one. what does a lot of the things that you talk about in your book and from the period, many of the themes we talked about today, how does that have relevance for us now? All right. So a little presentism, but that's fine. And I'm going to ask you again, the question I asked you in the beginning was sort of, after all of these things we've said, what is Lincoln's tragic pragmatism?
Okay. The first thing I want to say is that one thing that's changed since I wrote my book is that we live in a different America now.
How do you mean?
We live in a much scarier country. We live in a much less stable country. You know, I believed even in the second Bush administration, that one way or another, America was always going to blunder through and would always come out good enough, to use that famous term from Winnicott, that we were always going to be a good enough democracy. And I believed, because we'd seen it, the expansion of the idea of freedom to include gay people and trans people and so on in the Obama years. Because we've begun to see it, I had a great deal of hope for America. And when I was talking about the implicitness of values, I was talking about America continuing to perfect its democracy. And I certainly didn't anticipate that we'd be in the position we're in now. And I find the politics of the present moment terrifying and discouraging, partly because they resemble so much all the worst stuff that happened in the 1850s. And because so much of it turns on race, as the politics of the 1850s did, and turns on stuff about race that I thought we had outgrown. I have some hope that we'll wake up from this bender and maybe take a pledge of some kind not to do this again. But who knows? And the question about what tragic pragmatism means, I think it means every step we make is partial. Every step we make is fraught. Every step we make is tentative. And the ultimate end of our story is still an open question. Now, I had thought, if I had said that in 2013, I would have thought, well, an open question, but at least I think it'll likely be better. And at least for the next few years, I can't honestly say that. I don't know what's going to happen now.
Yeah, it is something that is, you know, I agree. I'm less sanguine about this than I was, you know, even 6-7 years ago. And you know, I you know, it does. I'm not a sensationalist and all these things, but I am deeply concerned, and more so to the point, the rest of the world does appear to me. I'm very much an international kind of person nowadays, and I just see the rest of the world moving on. When I travel,
they seem to have given up about us.
Yeah,
they?
right, exactly. Like I when I travel the world and I go to these different places, people are building things, they're creating things, and they're not. The United States isn't even in the conversation anymore, or not in a positive way.
They're not looking to our example, and they're technologically surpassing us.
That's
because
right. That's right.
They aren't spending their time fighting each other.
That's right. And that's at the very least, right? At the very least, we should want to be invested in getting our stuff together, so we're not, you know, kind of out of it. We don't have, you know, a seat at the table anymore. So at the very least, and then all the other things. So I fully agree.
We're so invested in settling scores.
Yeah, and I think you know, I think that's where your book and a lot of the things with the time, the 1850s and in the Civil War, of how to have engagement and reasonableness and how to respect, you know, the other and have good arguments is really, really helpful. John, this was, you know, such a blast.
I could go on for another hour.
I know I could go. I know I could do another hour, but 3.5 is such a treat. I've done 3.5 before a few times, and I always love it. And I you know, never in my wildest dreams when I first picked up your book and I read it that I would ever think that I have the privilege to talk with you about it for 3.5 hours. So big thanks for coming on, giving me so much of your time, your energy, your wisdom. I can't say enough thanks. Really,
Thank you for being such a great interlocutor. I mean, you really made this thing go.
I appreciate it. Big thanks.
Thank you.